Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. World War III alert. We got a World War III alert. 4 Americans dead, 6 or more captured. They tried to invade Cuba. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe y'all feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, it has begun. The CIA has tried to test the Cuban defenses, and it went bad for them.
The Ministry of Interior reported this Wednesday on an armed attack against a surface unit of the Border Guard forces in the northeast area of Canalizo El Pino in Cayo Falcones, Corralillo Municipality, Villa Clara Province.
As part of the ongoing investigative process, he points out that it has been established that the neutralized speedboat with Florida registration, it was transporting 10 armed individuals who, according to preliminary statements from the detainees, had intentions of carrying out an infiltration for terrorist purposes.
Assault rifles, short-barreled firearms, improvised explosive devices, Molotov cocktails, bulletproof vests, telescopic sights, and camouflage uniforms were all utilized.
Now, this was a small CIA infiltration force. They used a bunch of Cuban crash dummies from Florida, but this is a CIA-trained infiltration force. They were testing the Cuban defenses. Are you slipping anywhere in the waters near your border? And the Cubans taught them, hell no. And the whole world is laughing at the U.S. because you just was killing plenty of people in boats like this and call them narco traffickers. Nobody in the world cares that Cubans done punish these CIA infiltrators. Nobody cares. And everybody is saying Cuba had the right to defend themselves from these fentanyl traffickers.
Among the detained participants, based on preliminary interrogations, the following individuals were identified: Amigail Sánchez González, Liordán Enrique Cruz Gómez, Conrado Galindo Sarriol, José Manuel Rodríguez Castelló, Cristian Ernesto Acosta Guevara, and Roberto Ascora Consuegra.
Among the deceased, Miquel Ortega Casanova has been identified. Work is being done on the identification of the other 3.
All participants are Cuban nationals residing in the United States, most of whom have a known history of criminal and violent activities, including Amigail Sánchez González and Liordán Enrique Cruz Gómez, who appear on the national list of persons and entities that, by virtue of the resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 1373, international law, and the Cuban legal system, have undergone criminal investigations. And they are being sought by the Cuban authorities due to their involvement in the promotion, planning, organization, financing, support, or the commission of actions carried out within the national territory or in other countries in connection with acts of terrorism.
Additionally, the arrest was carried out within the national territory of citizen Daniel Hernandez Santos, who had been sent from the United States to ensure the reception of the armed infiltration and who is currently confessing to his actions.
The investigative process continues until the complete clarification of the events. The note is signed by the Ministry of Interior.
These crack dummies thought they was going to go take over a military base, take over a naval facility, cause a bunch of chaos. Now they're dead and captured. And the U.S. is looking very shameful today for sending those damn thugs into the Cuban waters like that. Got them people killed now.
I want to talk about the deadly incident off the coast of Cuba. Officials in Cuba say border guard troops shot and killed 4 people on a speedboat in Cuban waters who were trying to, quote, infiltrate the island nation on Wednesday. The Cuban Interior Ministry says the boat was registered in Florida and was carrying Cubans who live in the United States. One of the passengers allegedly opened fire on the border guard troops. 6 other people aboard the speedboat were wounded in the shootout and are receiving medical care while being held in custody. We've got CNN Stefano Pozzebon following the story for us. Stefano, good to see you. What do we know about this investigation? What transpired in this incident?
Well, unfortunately, we don't know much, and everything we know is directly from the Cuban government. So, of course, we need to take it with a little bit of caution. However, we do know that the incident took place at the northernmost tip of the Cuban coast, the part of the island of Cuba that is closest to Florida, that is closest to both Miami, the Miami community of anti-Cuban hotbed, frankly, and the Cuban Keys, which is the peninsula, that line of archipelago that drives south from the continental United States towards Cuba in South Florida. We know that 6 people have been so far apprehended by the Cuban government. The Cuban government and the Interior Ministry in particular have told us that 1 more person have been apprehended for flying into Cuba to organize the reception of what they're saying was a tripulation of terrorists. These 6 people, together with the 4 that have been killed in the standoff on Wednesday, are now accused of terrorism and trying to infiltrate the country, Cuba, in to stem a rebellion, to stem social disorder. We know that the Americans have called for a thorough investigation and for clarifying all the facts, in particular, not just the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, but also the Florida Attorney General, who is appointed by the Republicans, but also the mayor of Miami, who is a Democratic politician, but still called to take everything coming out of Cuba with a pinch of salt and asking for American U.S. investigators to clarify all the facts, especially if they link to the southern Florida community, the people in Miami, where we know that a change of government has been demanded when it comes to Cuba for more than 60 years. But this has the potential, Eleni, to rapidly escalate into the most serious geopolitical crisis of the year so far, especially after the removal of Nicolas Maduro down in Venezuela. It's a situation that we're monitoring very, very quickly, very, very closely, because it could escalate very quickly, Elena.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I want to talk about the current economic realities facing people in Cuba right now. Lifeline.
Because a blockade is an act of war. Let's move on to Cuba. So yesterday, in a firefight between a speedboat with 10 Cuban nationals from the United States and the Cuban Coast Guard, 4 of those Cuban nationals were killed. The rest of them were captured by the Cubans. The Cuban captain, according to the Cuban government, was wounded when this speedboat that was about 1 nautical mile off the coast of Cuba opened fire on it. We can put up A4 here. This is from Dropsite, laying out what the Cuban officials released later that night. They said they neutralized what they called a terrorist action. They said the men were armed with and seized with assault rifles, handguns, Molotov cocktails, body armor, telescopic sights, and camouflage uniforms, and that they were intent on meeting somebody on the island and fomenting some kind of revolt there. They also said that notably 2 of them, Amijal Sanchez Gonzalez and Leordan Cruz Gomez, had already been listed on Cuba's, quote, national list of persons and entities linked to terrorism, which is published weekly in their what that's called the official Gazette. That updated registry included 62 individuals, and so 2 of those individuals were on this ship. And they said they also detained Daniel Hernandez Santos inside the country. They said everybody has. The 6 that were captured, plus the one that was taken on land, have confessed to this. We can put up J.D. Vance, who was asked about this at a briefing. Here's A5.
Tell us anything you know about the situation off the coast of Cuba. There's a speedboat shot. You can briefed on that. You know, if Americans were killed or injured in it.
Yeah, so on the second thing, actually, Marco briefed me about 15 minutes ago on it, but we don't know a whole lot of details, and so I'll defer to the White House to provide more updates as we get them. Certainly, you know, a situation that we're monitoring. Hopefully, it's not as bad as we fear it could be, but can't say more because I just don't know more.
And so, Crystal, all 10 of the men on the speedboat were Cuban nationals who'd been living in the United States. We don't know yet if any had become American citizens or not, but we do know that they were they were armed and within a mile of the Cuban coast, and according to the Cubans, fired on the Coast Guard. They fired first, so we don't have video yet of this. It would be, I think, it would be unusual.
See how
for
the CIA do you?
The reason I
see how the CIA do you? Told these Cubans they was Americans now, nationalized them. You're a citizen now. Then they denied them when they die and get captured. Everybody know that's how the CIA work. Hey, we don't know you if you get captured. Hey, if they would have succeeded and took over a base and then called for help and Americans would have won, all that type of shit like they fantasized about, they would have been American heroes. But since you get captured and killed, hey man, there was some Cubans that just been living here. What a joke.
I credit the Cuban government account here is that it would just be unusual for the Cuban Coast Guard to just open fire on a ship like that.
Right.
They have basically never done that.
It wouldn't be in their interest
Not
either
remotely.
right now to provoke the U.S.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this perfect pretext. Like if you kill some American citizens, we don't, like you said, know if these are American citizens or not. Again, we learned from the Iran bloc where they're like looking for a pretext. Oh my God, you killed an American. Now we're going to bomb the shit out of you. Like they would love some sort of pretext to mess with Cuba. I don't know. What do you read in terms of the tea leaves here over whether these were just some like Miami Cubans freelancing or whether this was some sort of, you know, US CIA backed attempt to get on the island and cause some sort of mischief?
You know, on the one hand, it feels like the camouflage, you know, scopes, like assault weapons, like it feels like it has some, you know, sophistication behind it. On the other hand, this is the United States. You know, you can
not hard to access those things.
You can get all that stuff, you know, with a credit card. You know, we're not a place that makes it difficult, particularly in Florida, to arm up that boat in the way that they did. There is a Cuban exile community there that is extraordinarily radical, and there's a militant wing of it that, you know, this has shades of this.
It's just what happened during Kennedy. It's called a Bell to Pig. They tried this shit when Kennedy was president, bro. And got
scandal from many years ago called Brothers to the Rescue, where Miami exiles were flying over Cuba repeatedly, and the Cubans kept warning them stop, and then eventually shot the plane down. I believe it was a member of Congress or somebody else was recently pushing Trump to indict and then go capture Raul Castro for the murder of these four men in what's called this Brothers to the Rescue, you know, plane downing. So it has echoes of that. What links are there to American intelligence? You know, maybe we'll find out sooner rather than later. But it's plausible that, you know, there is enough of a militant, you know, easily armed community in Miami that would do this and believe that they're helping to spark some type of uprising on the island that would then lead to, you know, some significant American intervention. So could go either way. What do you think?
I mean, I think knowing a little bit more about the background of these individuals would be helpful. You know, certainly if one of them is like, oh, former Delta Force or whatever, you're like, okay, you know, a former Navy SEAL. We've seen this before. So, you know, for me, it's still a question mark. I find both explanations plausible, but, you know, maybe give us an update. One of the things that we were hopeful about when the Supreme Court struck down Trump's tariffs, and you brought this up immediately, Ryan, was, well, they've been using those tariffs to threaten Mexico and say, you can't send the oil that Cuba has already purchased. You can't send it to Cuba or else we're going to tariff the shit out of you. Well, that tool has been taken out of their arsenal. But when we talked to Jose of Dropsite News, your head of your Latin America desk, he was pretty doubtful that it would really change the calculation because his sense was that Claudia Sheinbaum had been told in no uncertain terms, like, no, this is really a problem for us, and and that she would be likely to listen and not violate the illegal oil embargo that we put on the island.
Yeah, because there are other tariffs that Trump can put on Mexican goods up to I think 50%. You can challenge them, and they will be challenged, no doubt.
Well, and Trump made the point. He's like, well, it's kind of ridiculous that I can destroy a country, but I can't levy tariffs. And I mean, in a sense, he's correct. Like, there's all kinds of ways that he could screw with Mexico that don't have to do with tariffs.
Right. So, it's a real question for Sheinbaum of how much she wants to, how important is it to her, to show solidarity with the Cubans and also show her sovereignty. When she was asked about it at her press conference, I believe it was yesterday, she did say, like, the tariffs that were preventing us from sending to Cuba have been ruled unconstitutional in the United States. So stay tuned as to what that means. So she did open the door to the possibility that this Supreme Court ruling will actually, is having her rethink that. Maybe she's just using that for leverage to get something else out of Trump behind the scenes. But it's still a jump ball. Like, it's back in play. Otherwise, in other words.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like
in a shootout between Cuban border troops and a Florida-registered speedboat carrying 10 Cuban exiles. According to the Cuban government, the men on the speedboat opened fire when Cuban border troops approached the boat for an inspection off the northeast coast of Cuba. The Cuban troops then fired back, killing 4 of the 6 men. 6 others were injured and are now being held in Cuba.
The Cuban government says the men were attempting to carry out, quote, an infiltration with terrorist ends, unquote. Cuban media reports the men were carrying weapons, Molotov cocktails, bulletproof jackets, and camouflage gear. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez said, quote, Cuba has had to face numerous terrorist and aggressive infiltrations from the United States since 1959, with a high cost in lives, injuries, and material damage. A rigorous investigation is being carried out to clarify the facts, he said. On Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the U.S. will investigate what happened.
Suffice it to say, it is highly unusual to see shootouts in open sea like that. It's not something that happens every day. It's something, frankly, that hasn't happened with Cuba in a very long time. But we're going to find out. We're not going to base our conclusions on what they've told us.
Marco Rubio, who's Cuban-American, was speaking at a gathering of Caribbean leaders in St. Kitts and Nevis. At the meeting, regional leaders expressed alarm about the growing humanitarian crisis in Cuba due to a U.S. oil blockade that has cut off the island from desperately needed fuel. The Trump administration recently threatened new tariffs against any nation that sends fuel to Cuba, which has been under a U.S. economic embargo since 1962. The U.S. has been ratcheting up pressure on Cuba since early January, when U.S. forces attacked Venezuela and abducted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores.
On Wednesday, the Treasury Department announced it would partially ease the blockade and allow Cuba's private sector to import Venezuelan oil, but restrictions remain on the Cuban government. The U.S. move is widely seen as another attempt by the Trump administration to weaken the Cuban government. We go now to Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink. She was in Cuba 2 weeks ago providing humanitarian aid. She was also just in Venezuela. Code Pink, the Progressive International, and other organizations are planning to launch a land, sea, and air humanitarian solidarity mission to Cuba in late March. So if you can deal with this breaking news, the 10 Cuban men, apparently, in a speedboat headed to Cuba. Explain what you understand happened. At this point, 4 are now dead, 6 have been taken by Cuba.
I understand that a boat that was carrying weapons and people who were going to infiltrate Cuban waters and somehow escape the U.S. Coast Guard because they're not allowed to even go to Cuba, managed to get within 1 mile of Cuba's northern province of Santa Clara, and that they were approached by a Cuban Coast Guard that wanted their identification. The U.S. boat opened fire, and in the shootout, there were 4 Cubans living in the United States who were killed and 6 were wounded. I should say that when the U.S. blows up boats in the Caribbean, when there are people in those boats that weren't killed, it goes back to kill them all. Instead, Cuba took the 6 to a hospital for treatment. I also want to say that the brother of one of those murders said, it was quoted in the AP story today, that his brother had fallen into a diabolical and obsessive quest to change the U.S. government, the Cuban government, a diabolical and obsessive quest. And I think that characterizes U.S. policy for the last 60 plus years.
So, Medea, could you say a little bit more? What is known about these 10, the 4 killed, the 6 detained? Were they all Cuban nationals, any of them American citizens?
They were all Cuban nationals living in the U.S. in Florida. 2 of them were on a Cuban wanted list for prior criminal activities, attempts at terrorism. And we're learning as the time goes by about the others of them. This has happened before. While Marco Rubio said it's unusual to have a shootout in the seas, that's true, but it is not unusual to have terrorists infiltrating Cuban territory. In fact, there are in the history blowing up of tourist hotels so that tourists would be afraid to go to Cuba, and constant attempts to infiltrate. Of course, there are hundreds of attempts to kill Fidel Castro. The southern Florida Cubans are obsessive and diabolical, and they must be stopped. And unfortunately, they are represented in our government, in our Congress, by people like Representative Maria Salazar, and also by Carlos Jimenez and Diaz-Balart, and they're represented at the highest level of government by our U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
Well, let's go to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is, as we mentioned earlier, Cuban-American, speaking on Wednesday.
What the Cuban people should know is this, that if they are hungry and they are suffering, it's not because we're not prepared to help them. We are. It's that the people standing in the way of us helping them, it's their Communist Party. That's who's standing in the way. If they move out of the way, we're more than happy to work with individual Cubans so they can have an opportunity to feed their families and build their economy. But we are not the impediment. They are.
So, Medea, that is Marco Rubio. If you could explain, you were just in Cuba a couple of weeks ago. I mean, Cuba has been under sanctions, a U.S. embargo since 1962. But explain what's happened in the last months when sanctions have been so tightened that prices are so high for basic items. I mean, as he mentioned, people are hungry, that they're totally out of reach. And also the food scarcity that there is now in Cuba.
Yeah, what Marco Rubio said would be laughable were it not so tragic. On January 11th, Donald Trump said that no oil and no money would be going to Cuba, zero. This is, as you said, a policy that has been going on for over 6 decades now, and it has been tightened in such a medieval siege type of way by Donald Trump. To stop all oil from going to Cuba has created where workers don't have transportation to get to work. When they get to work, there's no electricity. Students are having a hard time getting to school. The hospitals are having a hard time functioning. There's a terrible scarcity of medicines. The food is scarce and high priced. Farmers now don't have access to irrigation or fuel for tractors. This is a tragedy that's been going on and has been exacerbated since COVID. And with U.S. policies of putting Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list, which is something Donald Trump did, and unfortunately Biden waited to the last week of his presidency to lift, and then it was put on right again. This means that Cuba can't function in the world trade system. It can't use the international banks. These sanctions that the U.S. put on are not just to stop U.S. companies. They're designed to stop other countries countries and companies around the world from dealing with Cuba. And so you don't have fuel, the garbage piles up in the streets, the mosquitoes proliferate, mosquito-borne diseases proliferate. There's not the ability in the hospitals to take care of people. Cuba, once known for a lower infant mortality rate than in the United States, now infant mortality rate is rising. This is a tragedy. It's condemned every year by the world community, by everybody except the United States and Israel. And yet it keeps going on. And I think now, finally, the world community, and especially in Latin America, is rising up to say, no, we cannot let this keep going on.
Canada has announced $8 million in funding for Cuba as the country grapples with President Trump's oil embargo, as the UN warns of a humanitarian catastrophe in Cuba. Can you talk about what Code Pink, Progressive International, and other groups are doing? Talk about what you plan for the next weeks.
Yeah, we are excited to announce that on March 21st, there will be a convergence in Havana of people getting there by boat, by plane. There are also a group, the People's Forum, that will be collecting and is collecting lots of solar panels, taking them through Mexico to ship to Cuba. And people can also come on their own. We have chartered a plane from Miami that will fit 100 people. And we will be going, the delegation that is Code Pink, Progressive International, and Global Health Partners, leaving on March 20th to 23rd. You can join us. Go to the codepink.org page, and it's the first thing that will pop up. This is a time actually to go to Cuba. The Cubans have asked people to come in solidarity, to see the conditions there for themselves. We have to, especially in the United States, where we have such a responsibility for this catastrophe that is going on right now. We have to go there, we have to raise money for Cuba, and we have to protest Cuba policies in Congress. Call your congressperson. We have to show Marco Rubio that the U.S. community is absolutely opposed to a policy designed to create hunger and desperation.
Finally, you also just came back from Venezuela. We're in New York, not far from where the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife are imprisoned at the detention center in Brooklyn. The USS Gerald Ford, the largest aircraft carrier that was used in that attack and the abduction, is now nearing Iran in a massive military buildup. Not clear if Venezuela, the U.S. attack there, will be the model for perhaps an attack on Iran. But tell us about, in this last minute, what you found in Venezuela.
Play with Iran.
We found that people are horrified by what the U.S. did of coming in and abducting their president and the first lady on bogus charges. People also are horrified that the U.S. people don't even know or care that over 120 people were killed in that operation. Also, that there has been this economic warfare against Venezuela as well, designed to create hunger and designed and led to a mass migration that then the U.S. doesn't want the Venezuelans here anymore. They create the problem and then go in and say, okay, we're going to fix it. We're going to take Venezuela's oil and start rev up production. But it was the U.S. that led to the decline of the production by not allowing the spare parts to come in, by not allowing the companies to actually work there. So we're calling for the freedom of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. We're calling for a lifting of the sanctions because they haven't been lifted. We're calling for the U.S. to recognize the government now of the acting President Delcy Rodriguez so that there can be diplomatic relations. But I just want to say to close that this is a time of the Monroe Doctrine being accelerated now to the Donroe Doctrine, where the U.S. thinks that it can go into any country in Latin America. And now they're focusing on Venezuela and Cuba, but they have their sights set on Colombia, on Mexico, and other places. And that we cannot allow us to go back to the days of gunboat diplomacy, where the U.S. thinks that it is allowed to violate sovereign nations and it can have hegemony over the hemisphere. These are sovereign countries. We must leave them alone.
Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code
of dental offices that'll talk about doing their teeth in the day process.
Breaking developments at this hour after that deadly gun battle involving U.S. citizens off of Cuba, a U.S. speedboat and Cuban forces, and what ABC News has now learned tonight about that boat. Here's Martha Raddatz.
Tonight, U.S. officials confirming that at least one of the 4 people shot and killed on that Florida speedboat off the coast of Cuba was a U.S. citizen, and one of the 6 people wounded, a second U.S. citizen. Police say
more than that. See, they still trying to lie to y'all. Those are U.S. citizens. The rest of them, they was naturalized. They told them they were citizens. They're going to get their citizenship. They're just trying to disown them now because they've been killed and captured. That's a fact. Now they have to tell you, well, okay, 2 of them was for sure American citizens. Bro, the CIA sent American citizens to invade Cuba to test their defenses, and they got killed and captured. That's a fact.
Say the U.S. speedboat involved in the gun battle was reported stolen from this boat launch in the Florida Keys earlier this week. Cuba claiming the men were trying to infiltrate the island for terrorist purposes. The speedboat, according to the Cuban Ministry of Interior, reached within a nautical mile of the Alpino Channel when Cuban patrol boats approached the vessel. The Cubans claiming those on board the U.S. boat opened fire, prompting the Cubans to return fire. Cuba claims the suspects were armed with assault rifles, Molotov cocktails, and bulletproof vests, but provided no proof. The brother of a man he says was one of the boat's occupants, telling the Associated Press his brother had become obsessed with the quest for Cuba's freedom. The island nation is in the middle of a crippling energy crisis amid a U.S. quarantine of oil shipments. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Wednesday saying the U.S. will conduct its own investigation.
It is highly unusual to see shootouts in open sea like that. We're going to find out. We're not going to base...
No, it's not, because that's what the U.S. been doing. Everybody in the world know the U.S. been killing people on boats and said they was drug running. Plenty of them. That's not highly unlikely.
Conclusions on what they've told us.
And David, given that there was one American killed and another wounded, this is a complicated situation for the State Department since police say the boat was stolen and the Cubans say those men were heavily armed and fired on the Cuban troops first. David?
Martha Raddatz on this again tonight for us. Martha, thank you.
Here Comes the Sun, one of the most beautiful of the many beautiful songs penned by the late and great George Harrison. Well, it is already springtime, although it kind of doesn't feel like it yet. But the Chinese New Year is over, the Lunar Festival, the Spring Festival is over, and, well, here comes the sun, one must hope. But is it the sun? Or is it the nuclear blast? Because I have never known a time when nuclear threshold, even in rhetoric, never mind in military preparation, has never been lower. Israelis, including officials, including ministers, openly talk about their illegally held nuclear weapons and how they may very well fire them at the Islamic Republic of Iran, turning into a desert, of course. All the Arab satrapies, American satrapies, all around it. Well, I know they're a desert anyway. They're certainly a political desert, but the desertification of the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf would be complete and permanent. And that would be a lot less diamonds and pearls for Donald Trump to collect on his next visit to the area. But even more alarmingly, my own country and France, that is to say, the governments of Britain and France, are reportedly proposing to transfer nuclear materials for the production of a dirty nuclear bomb to give little Zelensky leverage in the talks. going on between the United States and the Russian government. If that's true, and it has not properly been denied, it has not been repudiated as an aim, then the lunatics have truly taken control of the asylum. This would not just be a criminal act. This would not just be an insane act. It would be the act that triggered all-out nuclear war in Europe. And for those of you on the other side of the Atlantic, it's highly likely if the United States observed its Article 5 obligations under the NATO treaty, which I'll grant you is very much a moot point, then it would be an intercontinental war. It would be the mother of all wars. It would be the end of all wars. If anyone survived it, they'd fight the next war with sticks and stones. It doesn't get any more serious than that, does it? The British government, with 11% approval rate in British public opinion, the French government, not much more popular, if more popular at all, are proposing to transfer their nuclear technology to the most unstable, to the most deeply corrupt, and to the most anti-democratic, the most illegitimate government in the continent of Europe. What could possibly go wrong? Well, only the end of the world. Give me love, give me peace on earth, sang George Harrison. All things must pass, said he. Well,
Nathan Watkins doesn't believe in limits, especially limits on property taxes. Watkins testified against Governor Abbott's property tax caps, saying,
"Tax caps are revenue caps."
Nathan Watkins is reckless and he'll leave you in his dust.
all things must pass, including he. But Keir Starmer's prime ministership will pass tomorrow night around 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning. If Labour lose, as they deserve to, the epochal parliamentary by-election in Manchester, Gorton and Denton, his prime ministership is over. Now, his successors might conclude that it's better if he hangs on until May so that he can take the blame for the tsunami of Labour defeats. It will be the slaughter of Labour councillors in May, and then someone else can take over afterwards. But it's my belief that if, as I expect, the Green Party, fighting with our support on a platform of opposition to war, opposition to the war that's getting ready to be waged in Iran, about which more in a couple of minutes, opposition to austerity, making the working class pay for crimes they never committed, for blunders they never made, and, of course, the need to punish the Starmer Labour Party for its absolutely transparent, from their own mouths, collaboration with Netanyahu's genocide in Gaza. If you're not going to punish a government for that, what are you ever going to punish a government for? And equally important, well, almost equally important, to reject the use of race baiting, religious and racial hatred being fomented by the right-wing British nationalist parties fighting in this by-election and across the country to keep them at bay, to stop their state-sponsored rise and rise. This is an important point. The deep state is encouraging these right-wing parties. In fact, let me take a flyer here, though my editor will curse me. I believe that the seizing of me and my wife at Gatwick Airport at gunpoint and our questioning about China and Russia, about Israel and Palestine for 9 hours in total at gunpoint was intimately connected to the Gorton and Denton by-election, which they must have known was in the offing. I had fought an election in Denton and Gorton before. We as a party have mass support in Denton and Gorton. We won a significant seminal victory in Gorton and Denton in the ward of Longsight not that long ago. They seized me and effectively made me leave the country precisely so that I could not stand in what turned out to be the imminent by-election in Gorton and Denton. But I'm done roaming. I'm 7 elections as a member of parliament is enough for me. Having been a member of parliament across 5 decades is enough for me. I am happy to support the Green Party candidate, and we fully expect a reciprocal backing in the 3 constituencies where we came second at the last general election. And everywhere that we have elected councillors, we will contend that we should have a clear run at those in the next general election. But the state of Keir Starmer was thought to be as low as it could go. But if he transfers nuclear material, if Macron transfers nuclear material to Zelensky, it will probably be the last thing that they ever do. Because in Moscow, they have been as clear as it is possible to be that any transfer of nuclear weapons to Zelensky will bring nuclear retaliation. In advance, preemptive nuclear retaliation, not just against Zelensky and his regime, but against Britain and France for their reckless and existential irresponsibility. And who could blame them if they did? Now, as I said at the beginning, if that's the state of your union, Donald Trump, you are welcome to it. The seals, the clapping seals, were divided. The Republicans clapped on immigration, on the economy, on the shredding of taxes to the richest people in the United States. The Democrats sat on their hands. But there was a crucial moment at which all the seals clapped together. There was a crucial moment when all of the seals got up on their hind haunches and clapped a standing ovation for Donald J. Trump. What do you think that particular moment? What was the proximate reason for the only joint standing ovation at the State of the Union speech in Washington, D.C. last night? That's right. It was Trump's. He's got a good memory, I've got to tell you. He memorized Benjamin Netanyahu's talking points absolutely perfectly. And he delivered them, albeit in that ham, actorly, kabuki theater kind of way. He delivered them with certain aplomb. And what were the lines? Well, they were a pack of lies, of course. He actually said that the Iranians refused to say that they will not build nuclear weapons, even though they say it every single day, and had said it that very day from the mouth of the man they're supposed to be meeting. I wouldn't necessarily expect them to turn up, by the way, Mr. Araghchi. But the foreign minister of Iran said it that very day, while Trump said to the world watching the State of the Union speech that the Iranians refused to say that they will not build nuclear weapons. When you are dealing with mendacity on that scale, you first of all got to ask yourself, how stupid are the people listening that they can clap that they don't know that that's a complete fiction, it is a falsehood, it is a bright, shining lie. He also said the Iranians were building ballistic missiles that could reach all the way to the United States. That's another brazen, total black lie. The Iranians have deliberately limited the range of their ballistic missiles to 2,000 miles, which is way short of the United States. Maybe Donald Trump meant to say that their ballistic missiles could hit one of our 800 US military bases around the world. Maybe he meant that, in which case he's right. Not only can they, Donald, they will. They will hit every United States base, and the poor bloody infantry of the United States Army, Navy, and Air Force will pay with their blood, which Lindsey Graham says is a price worth paying to defend Netanyahu and Israel. For make no mistake, that is the one and only reason why the United States imminently, apparently, is going to launch a shock and awe mass bombardment for weeks of Iranian people, property, and things, of Iranian infrastructure, water, electricity, houses, priceless architectural treasures, including, by the way, some of the most priceless Jewish architectural, historical treasures to be found anywhere in the world, because, of course, Iran has the largest Jewish population outside of Israel in the region, and other than in New York City, in the world. Shock and awe, blood and gore, blood and treasure, being burned, being incinerated, all for Israel. Tell me what else it can be for. What threat is Iran to the United States of America? The United States of America is many thousands of miles away. It is America that has surrounded Iran with its nuclear and other firepower, not the other way around. The people of Iran have not.
Peter Pan here. You know, I thought growing up would be the worst. Bills, responsibility.
Invaded anybody in 300 years, but plenty of people have invaded them, and all of them with the support of the very powers that are currently besieging Iran right now. The Iranians are not going to build a nuclear war. More fool them, in my opinion. I saw little Kim Jong-un being re-elected as the Korean Workers' Party president. Seems popular, by the way. There's nobody floating aircraft carriers off the coast of Korea. There's nobody threatening to invade North Korea. There's nobody sending Starlink illegal paraphernalia into North Korea, they wouldn't last 5 minutes if they did. Nobody is going to attack North Korea because they have nuclear weapons. But Iran, for its own theological reasons, has turned its face against nuclear weapons and says so every single day. The United States has no casus belli other than the hatred of Netanyahu for Iran and the determination of the Greater Israel Project to completely dominate from the River Nile to the River Euphrates in Iraq, taking out half of Egypt, taking out all of Palestine, all of Lebanon, all of Jordan, much of Saudi Arabia, and half of Iraq. That's their Greater Israel. They wear patches on their military sleeves delineating this Greater Israel. What do you think those two stripes on the Israel flag represent? They represent the Nile and the Euphrates. When they say from the river to the sea, they don't mean the Jordan River and they don't mean the Mediterranean Sea. That's what this is all about. And so you would need to ask yourself, why would the United States expend its blood and treasure in defense of such a project? Why would the United States destroy its own allies, having gratuitously insulted them in the mouth of Mike Huckabee last week? Why would it now endanger the very existence of the family dictatorships that rule the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf? Why would they do that? The answer is Jeffrey Epstein. The answer is the cash and the compromat that they have used to state capture the United States of America, the United Kingdom, France, and other countries, including Canada. And I'm about to speak about Canada right after this short break. It's Eve Engler.
Undeclared war. Leading up to it, what is the significance of the NATO orchestrated Ukraine use of a British manufactured missile known as the Flamingo to attack 800 miles deep inside of Russia and destroy part of one of their most important munitions plants?
Well, what's the use of it? I think they're trying to signal, foolishly, in my judgment, the Russians that as long as the Ukrainians have access to Western satellite-based intelligence, that everything is a potential target. Secondly, the Flamingo, which is assembled in Ukraine, as we know, is not really a Ukrainian product. They're simply assembling components from the Czech Republic, Great Britain, possibly Germany, maybe the French, I don't know. They think that this is going to also signal to the world that Ukraine is alive and living and still has some fight in it. I think the only thing they've done is push the Russians to the edge of responding cataclysmically against Great Britain in particular. One of the things that you learn from the Russians when you listen to them carefully is they blame much of what's wrong in Ukraine on the British. And they have a point. The British are not alone. We are also continuing to supply intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. We even have some U.S. pilots flying F-16s for the Ukrainians, and these are not unknown to the American government. They are there with our permission. So I think it's tempting the Russian bear to strike back very decisively. And I think they should be more careful than they are. But again, President Trump, as the leader of NATO, not just as president of the United States, can really force an end to this conflict. He hasn't done it. Just standing there and telling Zelensky that he should sit down and talk to Mr. Putin is absurd. So the longer this drags on, the greater the likelihood that the war inevitably spreads. And that's the danger of this kind of attack.
Are the U.S., Russian, Ukrainian negotiations serious in light of CIA trying to assassinate Putin, or at least to destroy his country home, the U.S. jets above Kyiv, and now this thing with the Flamingo?
I think the Russians do not consider them to be serious. I think the Russians are tired of listening to remarks that signal the good intentions from President Trump. They're interested in actions. They want to see substantive action to end this war. We haven't provided that. It doesn't appear that we're about to do so in the near future. So I think the real answer to your question is the Russians don't think it's serious, and I don't think they're any longer paying attention to it.
To Iran, Colonel, here's the president's best recitation of what Prime Minister Netanyahu told him. Cut number 13.
They've already developed missiles that can threaten Europe and our bases overseas, and they're working to build missiles that will soon reach the United States of America. After Midnight Hammer, they were warned to make no future attempts to rebuild their weapons program, and in particular, nuclear weapons. Yet they continue, starting it all over. We wiped it out, and they want to start all over again, and are at this moment again pursuing their sinister ambitions. We are in negotiations with them. They want to make a deal, but we haven't heard those secret words. We will never have a nuclear weapon. My preference is to solve this problem through diplomacy. But one thing is certain, I will never allow the world's #1 sponsor of terror, which they are by far, to have a nuclear weapon. Can't let that happen.
Nathan Watkins doesn't believe in limits, especially limits on your property taxes. Watkins testified.
So a couple things. You saw the look on General Kane's face, who the Washington Post reported has told the president he can't achieve his military goals. I'll ask you if you agree in a minute. That statement that the president made was the only one in 1 hour and 48 minutes that induced a standing ovation from everybody in the room, including the Democrats. We all know why. Thank you, AIPAC. Your thoughts?
This is nothing new. All of these arguments or demands are straight from Mr. Netanyahu. President Trump is simply reading them back to the American audience. And as you point out, when you have multiple Zionist billionaires ready to put enormous quantities of money into the pockets of various members of Congress by funding their campaigns or threatening to fund their opponents, you're going to get the kind of response that you saw. This is very dangerous, though, because there are certain assumptions these people in Washington are making right now. That Iran is weak, just as they insisted that Russia was weak. And since Iran is weak, we can bully Iran, just as we thought we could bully Russia. Very serious mistake. This is not the case at all. And I think we're going to get an education in the near future. But I think the most important aspect of this whole business is to keep in mind that the Iranians have heard all of this before. The Iranians could promise never to climb Mount Everest, just as we make lots of promises to people that we will never do something or we will do something. And both the Russians and the Iranians have learned that they can't depend heavily on anything that any particular president subscribes to. They learned that when the JCPOA was thrown out arbitrarily by President Trump. They thought that they had come to an agreement with the United States government. It was ultimately an agreement exclusively with President Obama. So the notion that we're going to extract a promise of any kind from them at this point, I think, is ludicrous. Here's the final point, and this is perhaps the most important. All of our actions for many decades now, but at this moment, the actions are more profound than they have ever been before, are convincing nations all over the world that they need nuclear weapons. They need a nuclear weapon to prevent us from interfering in their internal affairs. They need a nuclear weapon to be protected against our attack. And frankly, it's surprising to me that the Iranians continue to insist that they do not want and will not build a nuclear weapon. And I think they're telling the truth. And I think that comes straight from the top, from the supreme leader. But I don't know how much longer this will last. And that's the folly of this entire air and missile campaign, that you're going to fundamentally change everything with airstrikes. Now, as far as General Kane is concerned, two things. First of all, whatever passes between General Kane and President Trump is something that General Kane should never, ever discuss with anyone. When Marshall was the chief of staff of the Army and principally not quite the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that was Admiral Leahy, but he controlled both the Army and the Air Force and worked closely with Admiral King. Whatever happened between Marshall and FDR stayed with FDR in the White House, did not find its way into the public discourse. And anybody that stepped forward and said, well, Marshall says, everybody knew instantly because of Marshall's integrity, that was nonsense. Now, I hope that what we're hearing about General Kane's views is nonsense. It has nothing to do with whether he is right or wrong. It has everything to do with his position as a senior advisor, military advisor to the President of the United States. Whatever he says needs to stay with the president. The president wants to tell everybody, I had a discussion with General so-and-so, and this is what I think. That's his privilege. There's nothing to prevent him from doing that. So I hope what we're hearing is nonsense. If it isn't, and we discover that senior officers have leaked information to the press that is designed to inoculate them against any possible blame for what goes wrong, which is really what we're talking about, they should all be removed immediately. Right. That's not their job.
But if you were the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you would probably advise against the war, as according to this article, General Kane did.
Well, again, we don't know that. And if General Kane feels strongly that this is a danger to the American people, a danger to the United States, that is the air and missile campaign, then he should resign. He should go to the president and say, I can't go along with this. I think this is a fatal mistake. I wish you well, but I cannot, and with a clear conscience, help to conduct this operation.
Right.
I don't see any evidence for that, and I have never seen any evidence for that. Certainly, well, not in my lifetime, and I don't think we've seen anything since 1965 that approaches that.
What damage can the Iran military, what do they call themselves, Revolutionary Guard, I'm not sure of the terminology, visit upon American assets on land and sea and on Israel?
Well, Larry Johnson has written a piece that's well worth everybody's attention, where he outlines the disposition of our forces. I'm not sure that's a great idea, but under the circumstances, it's open information. And I'm sure that the satellite-based intelligence has detected all of it anyway. But it's worth looking at because he shows you the numbers of aircraft, their general locations. But what you really need to take away from what Larry presents are a couple of things. First of all, when we talk about radars that can acquire target forms for stealth aircraft at 420 miles distance. That is by any means today revolutionary, by any measure. So that's the first thing. Is that going to happen? Well, we don't know. None of the radars that the Chinese have in place in Iran for Iran's defense have been tested in combat. So we just don't know. But if you start drawing arcs around Iran, you realize that many of the ground-based aircraft and sea-based aircraft are roughly 1,000 kilometers or more from the target areas. That means that they've got to refuel en route, and when they complete their run and come back out after dropping the ordnance, they've got to refuel again. This is enormously complex, and it's very dangerous. Now, the second part is, can they acquire us, and do they have the missiles with the range and the lethality to shoot us down? Well, it appears that is probably the case. Once again, how many do they have? Are their missile stocks infinite in that regard? Who knows? And then finally, you have some of these new Chinese weapons that are hypersonic, cruise missiles and theater ballistic missiles that could conceivably find a target at sea at great length, not just Israel itself or bases in Western Jordan or anywhere else on the Arabian Peninsula, but could actually sink, or not sink, that at least damage and put out of action U.S. ships. That appears to be the case. So we're walking into something that's brand new. Let me digress for one quick session here. And I'm not doing this just to promote the last book I wrote, but the opening chapter of this book that I wrote called Margin of Victory deals with the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. A lot improved in the British Army between the Boer War and World War I. But the British Army was very small, and it was still accustomed to dealing with fairly weak opponents. Well, I think we have to understand that the United States Air Force has not faced any serious air defense capability since we fought the Serbs. And the Serbs performed very well. But that's what, 25, 26, 27 years ago. So that means that our airmen have been able to fly with impunity all over Afghanistan, all over Iraq, on top of Libya, wherever they've wanted to go, they've been able to get there. This is probably not going to be the case with Iran. So this is creating a very new set of conditions for our air and naval forces. They're actually going to be shot at. They're going to be under fire, and they're going to have to plan and maneuver carefully to avoid being shot down. How will all of this work? I don't know. Nobody does. And it's impossible for us sitting this far away to evaluate it. But that is now real. So we are much like the British in 1914, having a long history of dealing with weak opponents, now facing a very serious opponent. And it's worth pointing out that in 1914, in the opening battles, the British army that was sent to France was almost exterminated, wiped out. And I don't think that will happen to our air and naval forces, but it's worth considering that the danger exists.
Here's my grasp, Colonel, on the president's dilemma. He has amassed what he calls an armada. By any nomenclature, it's an enormous amount of naval equipment right there south of Iran and west of Iran in the Mediterranean. If he doesn't use it offensively in his own mind and in that of his backers, particularly his Zionist backers, he's going to look weak. On the other hand, if he uses it, he's going to unleash forces that he can't control, which may result in catastrophic damage to Israel and even to American troops, naval, air force, and on the ground in some of those Arabian countries where we have encampments. What's your understanding of his dilemma?
Well, you're 100% on target. I would go a few steps further and add to what you said. If the Straits of Hormuz, the traffic through the Straits is...
Let me just stop you for a second. Here's your book, Margin of Victory, which some of the chatters who are your fans have said, what does it cost? Well, they can go to Amazon and get it.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Judge. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Anyhow, to go back to your comments, which I agree with entirely, if we disrupt traffic through the streets, or it is simply stopped or halted for some reason, we're going to watch, the price of oil go through the roof. It's going to have a destabilizing impact on global economies. Let's be frank. Capital flees from crisis areas and conflict areas. It moves to places where there's stability and peace. So that's very, very clear. And it's not just oil and gas. Supply chains will suffer. We forget all the products that are dependent upon petroleum. So let's just make it clear that this war, even if we're very careful and we're very lucky, is going to have a negative impact on the global economy. And that's going to hurt us at home as well. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other piece of this is that if we do lose substantial numbers of aircraft or ships, now that may only mean, 3, 4, 5 of the high-end aircraft and perhaps 1 or 2 ships are damaged, the reputational damage to us will be severe. Because right now, right or wrong, most of the world tends to view our military establishment as invincible and invulnerable. And there's a lesson in history that if you don't have to fight, you really ought not to, not only for the reasons that you mentioned, which are completely valid, but because of the potential damage to your reputation and your national security that could result from it. So I would put all of those together right now, and I don't know what the president is going to decide to do. I think he's under tremendous pressure for the reasons that you outlined to go ahead and strike. But I think if he does, we have to reckon with some of what I added to your list.
Colonel Politico is reporting that the White House wants Israel to go first in the hopes that Iran will attack American soldiers in the Middle East, thereby giving Trump a pretext for war. Because right now, this potential, whatever you want to call it, attack or invasion is enormously unpopular, not in the Congress, but amongst the people represented in the Congress.
Well, clearly, Judge, the people that are on the Hill that were elected to represent Americans are, for the most part, disinterested in what you just described. They are looking at their own future and their own selfish interests. And they are very much willing to support the president in whatever action he wants to take, because it is in their judgment, in Israel's interest. Now, there's something else. There are a lot of people who think that this could have severe consequences for other people's economies. This could harm BRICS. It could stop the Belt and Road project. I don't think those things are true. I think they'll all recover anyway. But this is another layer of conflict. We're looking at the Israeli conflict with Iran and virtually the entire Islamic world at this point. That's one problem in which we have been entangled. But the even greater one is that we are increasingly seen as fighting against the future that is inevitable. And that future is very different from the recent past. We are not going to be the only superpower. We are not going to dominate the globe financially. Our currency is not going to be the ironclad reserve currency of the past. We're already watching gold replace it as effectively the world's reserve currency. So those things are also in play right now. Now, if we're trying to be cute and orchestrate this thing by telling the Israelis, well, you go first and then we'll take it from here, that may please people on the Hill. It may reassure people in the White House. But who really thinks Americans are that stupid? I don't. I think Americans know damn well what's happening. And you've looked at the polls, 70%, 75%, 85% opposed to war in the Middle East, opposed to war with Iran. I don't think Americans are stupid. So whatever you do, it's not going to make any difference to them.
How it feels to have a TurboTax expert do your self-employed taxes for just $150.
With TurboTax, we're confident our business.
Well, I'm thinking of Pearl Harbor and how the country went from 80% against war to 80% in favor of war in about 2 weeks. I'm thinking of the revisionist history, which argues that FDR sacrificed the 2,700 sailors that were murdered that day. And now I'm thinking, can you imagine a president of the United States using his own troops as pawns?
Well, I think we have to accept that's probably behind the thinking that you outlined. But there's a difference. Remember, the Japanese made the fatal mistake of attacking America without quote unquote provocation. Now, you and I know, and in fact, Marshall and King, King was the chief of naval operations, Marshall, the chief of staff of the Army and the Air Force. They knew in June that Roosevelt was going to announce the blockade, if you will, not blockade, what's the right word for it? Embargo, exactly, on oil and other things to Japan. And they both said, look, the Japanese are up against the wall. We put them in a corner. They're going to attack. They all focused on the Philippines. It never occurred to them, at least not seriously, to the people in power, that Pearl Harbor would be the target. Well, the Japanese, had they attacked the Philippines, who knows what the response would have been. But at that point, Hawaii was viewed as American. It was on a Sunday morning. We were still a religious people at that point. We actually went to church on Sunday morning. And these Americans who had gone to church came running out of church to go back to Pearl Harbor to try and move the ships. They were killed. We were seen universally as victims. And Americans felt strongly we had to strike back. This time around, we're sailing in other people's seas. We're off the coasts of other people's countries. And we're attacking a country that is not our own. We have no real stake in it. And Americans, I think, are not going to react the way they did to Pearl Harbor at all.
Your argument is unassailable, Colonel, and of course your grasp of history is second to none. Do you think the decision to attack is an affirmative one and has already been made?
Yes. I've felt that way for a long time.
Yeah.
I don't think the president has a great deal of maneuver room. And I was just reading before I came on, most recent material coming out of Iran. The Iranians are saying that the Americans are insisting that for Israeli and American interests, Iran is prohibited from enriching any uranium. And the Iranians have simply said, that's unacceptable. We're not going to do that. Now, we haven't even touched on the other things because they made it clear they're not going to limit their missile arsenal to satisfy the Israelis. In other words, to give the Israelis the opportunity to kill them at will, but no means for them to respond.
Right.
And they're not going to abandon their allies in the region. So it looks to me like these talks are not going to succeed. Not that I ever really thought they would. I think the demands are too stringent and they can't possibly be accepted by the Iranians. The Iranians are not going to submit. They're not going to capitulate. They see themselves at this point as the last men standing. The interesting part is that the Turks, on the other hand, are really paying a great deal of attention right now. And if you look at the press, they're beginning to figure out in the public media that if Iran goes down, that they're probably next. Since the Israeli former Prime Minister Naftali announced to the world within the last week that Turkey poses potentially a much greater threat to Israel than Iran does.
Jeez.
And so if you're a Turk watching that, you say, well, gosh, I guess I'm number 2 on the menu. So I think this has gone too far at this point.
Yeah, but Erdogan is not possession.
One last thing I would say, Judge, and that is, you remember 2016. President Trump came out of nowhere. He funded much of the campaign on his own. And to everyone's surprise, and I would argue to his as well, he won. He lost in 2020. And he lost dramatically because of a whole range of reasons. He was very bitter and angry. But I think he figured out that the billionaires that currently are calling the tune and shaping U.S. foreign and defense policy were the ones that didn't support him in 2020. But with their support, he won the White House. I don't think he can walk away from his promises to them. And one of those promises was, I think, that he would corner Iran and make it submit or attack it.
Here's the Iranian foreign minister yesterday, Chris, cut number 6.
President Trump has always complained about fake news. So I think now it is himself the victim of fake news, unfortunately. We are not developing, long-range missiles, and we have limited the range of our missiles below 2,000 kilometers intentionally by ourselves because we don't want anyone. We don't want it to be like a global threat. This is only to defend ourselves. Our missiles has, defense nature. They are only to build deterrence and to help us defend ourselves, exactly as they did in the last June's war. We didn't initiate that war. It was Israelis and then Americans. We only defended ourselves. For them, that was an illegal act of aggression. For us, it was legitimate act of self-defense.
You pass the challenge. You think you made it. Then you blow the account again. Sound familiar? It's not your fault. It's the system you've been sold. Why do so many traders pass only to blow the account right after? You've probably been there. You pass the challenge, then boom, you blow the funded account. Or worse, you just can't stay consistent long enough to get real payouts. So it's back to square one. Another reset, another restart. And the cycle never ends. Here's the brutal truth. There's too much noise in the market right now. You don't know who to trust. Everyone's claiming they've cracked the code, but most of them, they make their money from selling education, not from trading. You need to learn from someone who's actually in the game, someone whose main income is trading, not courses. That's what separates the pros from the posers. And that's why.
Do you agree?
Yes. I can't disagree with the man at all. And you've pointed out, and I think accurately, that the only thing we're doing right now by preparing to attack Iran is convincing everyone in the world that you really need a nuclear weapon if you're going to avoid an attack from the United States. So I think we're doing everything we can to cause the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Then again, I also have the same view of what the Israelis are doing, which is extremely dangerous to the future of Israel. But, we hold the minority opinion.
Great. Colonel, thank you very much. I don't know when the attack is going to come, but when it does, we'll call on you and Cuban intelligence and some, I guess, Americans.
Yeah, this was something that was consistent with the behavior of Cuban exiles in South Florida and Miami going back to the 1970s, where it looks like they staged a terrorist attack on Cuba, attempting to land a speedboat off the city of Santa Clara in Cuba, and then carry out guerrilla-style terrorist attacks inside Cuba to destabilize the country at a point when its population is suffering in unprecedented ways from the oil embargo imposed by Donald Trump, which, according to people I've spoken to on the island and who just came from there, is really causing a humanitarian crisis. So one figure who's associated with this attack is named Amijail Sanchez Gonzalez. And there's a Facebook account associated with Amijail Sanchez, and it shows records of terrorist attacks that have already taken place in recent months in Cuba, including people setting fire to buildings and farmland, agricultural fields. He was one of the figures who was detained on this boat. There's so many points to make here. One point is that the Cuban Coast Guard or Cuban Defense Forces managed to neutralize the attackers on this boat and wounded many others. But unlike the United States, which has been carrying out double tap strikes on fishing boats, ostensibly carrying marijuana and cocaine, they didn't kill everybody gratuitously. They captured many people, including Sanchez Gonzalez, and learned the identities and gave them treatment. So much more humane than the U.S., than the Pentagon has been.
Didn't the people on this boat shoot and injure a Cuban officer on the Cuban military or Coast Guard boat?
The passengers on this boat attacked the Cuban Defense Forces or Cuban Naval Forces first and wounded the commander on a boat before they were all taken out. So this was an attack on Cuba, an attack on Cuban sovereignty. In a press conference today, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was unable to offer a coherent answer on what took place here. He was stuttering. And the question is, what did he know and when did he know it? Because it's very difficult for an American, even with a fast boat, to go disembark from the coast of Florida and get 90 miles through the Caribbean to Cuba without being interdicted by the U.S. Coast Guard. It is illegal to do so from the United States. So how did they get through Coast Guard interdiction and Coast Guard surveillance of that entire highly sensitive area? What did Marco Rubio know? Marco Rubio commands these forces in South Florida in so many ways. This is Marco Rubio's policy of terrorizing Cuba. And as we reported at the Gray Zone, relying on FBI interviews, leaked documents, and our own reporting, there was this other operation known as the Bay of Piglets against Venezuela. We actually interviewed the lead mercenary of this operation, Operation Gideon, in which groups of mercenaries attempted the same thing in Venezuela to topple the government by landing on a Venezuelan beach. They were caught. Many of them were killed. The rest were captured. This involved U.S. former Green Berets. And, you know, from everything we were able to deduce from these documents, from the interviews with Jordan Goudreau, the mercenary leader, the U.S. intelligence knew all about this plot. And they let it go into action. They did not attempt to stop it in any meaningful way. And that's what it looks like here. And again, the Operation Gideon plot against Venezuela may have failed, but it was a pretext for the U.S. military invasion of Venezuela, which saw the U.S. kidnap Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. And just another point that I think is important here is during the 1970s, something like 40% of all terrorist bombings in the world were being carried out by Cuban exiles from Miami with the support of the CIA. Posada Carriles is one terrorist figure who was groomed in Miami, who bombed Cubana Flight 455 in 1976. Cubana Flight 455 was at the time carrying the North Korean fencing team. 76 passengers were killed. Posada Carriles was a strictly protect figure who was then given sanctuary in Panama for this attack. He was never punished. He died a free man, and his partner in planting the bomb, Orlando Bosch, was celebrated in Florida, in Miami, with an Orlando Bosch Day, which was authorized under the watch of Governor Jeb Bush. Cuban exile terrorists from Miami have killed Cubans while they were on beaches, mowed down Cuban civilians. They have bombed Cuban hotels throughout the 70s and 80s. And anyone who wants to see a very accurate, dramatic rendition of this period in Cuban history should watch the WASP Network, the film about the so-called Cuban Five, who are a network of Cuban spies in the United States who were assigned with the task of breaking down this network of Cuban terrorists, and did a fairly effective job. And then were all arrested and given life sentences and got released as part of a sort of a prisoner swap with the U.S. We actually interviewed one of them at the Gray Zone and have that on our YouTube channel. But now this period, this dark period of CIA-backed terrorism appears to be returning to Cuba under the watch of Marco Rubio.
And now they have their boy in power as the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor.
Exactly.
And probably assumed that he would have their back, and we'll find out once he gives a coherent statement, if he has their back. Switching over to the Middle East, has there been any fallout from the nonsense that came out of the mouth of Ambassador Huckabee in the Tucker Carlson interview about Israel is entitled to all the land in the Middle East?
Well, I think we saw the fallout in the form of a Saudi organized statement of all of the Arab states who are basically vassals and who are expected to play ball with Israel through some form of cold peace, actually protesting Huckabee, declaring that their land, their countries, could be part of greater Israel according to the Bible. This was an unprecedented statement, and I think it really did complicate the case for war on Iran. Tucker deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. If the Nobel Peace Prize had not been converted into the Nobel War Prize, he would deserve it for his efforts in interrogating not just the crooked U.S. policy being implemented from occupied Jerusalem against Palestinians, but the entire ideology behind it, which is embodied by Mike Huckabee, who is right now the world's most influential Christian Zionist. But that's obviously not enough to stop the war. I think there are two factions within the Trump administration who are jousting right now, almost in public, to either sabotage a potential deal with Iran or to make a deal. And the terms that I'm seeing laid down on the table in Geneva are onerous and absolute deal breakers for any proud sovereign nation.
What are those terms and what are the two camps? Let me back up a little bit. The Washington Post reported 2 or 3 days ago, so I could stop right there and say that means the CIA wants us to know that General Kane, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told the president, we're not going to be able to achieve your goals. Before the sun came up on the morning of this headline, I think it was Tuesday, the president issued on Truth Social. He didn't say that, don't believe it. The Washington Post piece was very long, very well documented. And if you look at the look on General Kane's face, which we will look at together in a few minutes, when Trump made the only remark that caused the Democrats to applaud him as well as the Republicans, you will see that Kane seemed to be disbelieving what he was hearing. So, do you believe that the military is telling him we can't do it?
Well, obviously, I mean, not Pete Hegseth.
No.
Hegseth.
The serious military guys, not Hegseth.
Yeah, I mean, Pete Hegseth might be on sort of a perpetual roid bender, but the serious people inside the Pentagon, for example, in the DIA, might understand that there just aren't enough naval assets to sustain a weeks-long assault on Iran and actually achieve any meaningful goal, regime change, degradation of military assets, without paying a serious price. And General Kane, I mean, he talks to the people in procurement in the Pentagon. That's what he's basing his assessments off of. Will they be able to procure enough Patriot missiles and THAAD missiles to defend Israel alone? No. So that speaks to their opposition and the fact that someone at a very high level in the Pentagon leaked to not just one, but 3 mainstream outlets, Axios, the Washington Post, and I think the Wall Street Journal, just to illustrate how serious they were about their concern about going into Iran, a war that cannot be won just by kidnapping one leader and which could drag on for weeks or even months, that the vast majority of Americans are opposed to. Then go ahead.
Here's the core of the president's understanding of why the United States is threatened by Iran. I want you to listen to it. It's the only standing ovation he got that the Democrats cheered as well, because they're bought and paid for by AIPAC and their colleagues as well. And then I'm going to ask you, after we listen to this nonsense, what lies did the Israelis tell Trump. Chris, cut number 13.
They've already developed missiles that can threaten Europe and our bases overseas, and they're working to build missiles that will soon reach the United States of America. After Midnight Hammer, they were warned to make no future attempts to rebuild their weapons program, and in particular, nuclear weapons. Yet they continue, starting it all over. We wiped it out, and they want to start all over again, and are at this moment again pursuing their sinister ambitions. We are in negotiations with them. They want to make a deal, but we haven't heard those secret words. We will never have a nuclear weapon. My preference is to solve this problem through diplomacy. But one thing is certain, I will never allow the world's #1 sponsor of terror, which they are by far, to have a nuclear weapon. Can't let that happen.
Guys, Blue Chew Gold is the only one that's combining sildenafil, tadalafil, and apomorphine.
What lies did Netanyahu and company tell him to get him to say that?
Well, we know what lies they told him. And we know that they told him that Iran is a week away from developing a nuclear weapon. But that's not Netanyahu's main objective here. The no deal faction, which is a vehicle for Israeli influence, is represented by Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham. And they want the focus to not be on Iran's nuclear program, because for Iran, that's not necessarily a red line. That's negotiable. They want the focus to be on Iran's deterrence, its allies, and its ballistic missiles. Because once Iran gives that up, they can be balkanized and dismantled as a nation. And Iran is not going to give that up under any circumstance. That is a red line. So listen to the rhetoric that you've heard since the State of the Union. You can get a sense of how all of that rhetoric, including some of that 2003 WMD style rhetoric, was packed into Trump's speech. All of these different factions had input on the State of the Union, and now you can see them separated out through their own individual statements. Rubio saying there's no, Iran has not actually restarted its nuclear program. We destroyed it all. Which, they didn't destroy it all, but Iran is not moving towards a nuclear weapon. There's no evidence of that. Lindsey Graham is saying there's no room for any nuclear negotiation at all, not even the civilian facility in Tehran that was built under the Shah that is just used for medical research. None. And the issue should be ballistic missiles, no nuclear negotiation. Then on the other side, you have J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff hyping up the threat of Iran's nuclear program, which could be interpreted as them setting the stage for Trump making a dramatic deal that eliminates this threat, but also ends the possibility of war. And so those are the two factions as I see it. And it's the former faction that is clearly a vehicle for Israeli influence. Now, if we look at the terms, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, advanced in Geneva, they're very onerous terms, and they may be a deal breaker that can lead us to war, even though they focus largely, if not exclusively, for now, on the nuclear program. Number one, Iran's being asked to dismantle Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. That is a deal breaker. No sovereign nation would do that. They would certainly submit them to inspection. Number two, they are being asked to transfer all enriched uranium to the United States. That's a deal breaker. They have offered to maintain their uranium in consortium with Arab states inside Iran, states that are U.S. allies, but they're not going to transfer their uranium out. And then, zero enrichment. They're offering near zero enrichment, but then there's another term, minimal sanctions relief. Okay, Iran barely got any sanctions relief from JCPOA, and that's the only reason that they would negotiate over their nuclear program is sanctions relief. If they're not going to get any, then what that signals to them is that they make a deal just to avoid war, but then down the line, the sanctions relief will be contingent on them giving up their ballistic missiles and giving up their regional alliances. So they're ultimately going to have to make a deal on Israel's terms anyway. That's why I think these terms are a non-starter.
They're impossible to comply with. I'm looking at the headlines of today's Financial Times. Iran, tell me what you think or know about this. Iran tempts Trump with, quote, bonanza for U.S. companies in bid to avoid war. Have they offered the United States oil and gas rights?
Sure. This is their idea of the way to Trump's heart is Trump is transactional. And if you actually take the Israelis out of the equation, this is the kind of relationship the U.S. would have had with Iran. This is what Maduro was trying to do with Trump before he was kidnapped. And now it's what Venezuela's remaining Chavista government is doing anyway. Iran would be eager to make deals with the U.S., and it would be very lucrative for the United States and for Trump and his little crony corruption ring if they were to go along with it, but the Israelis won't let them. No matter what kind of deal Trump makes with Iran, if it doesn't result in Iran dismantling its own, essentially surrendering its own deterrent capacity and rendering itself vulnerable to dismantlement, that's something that the Israelis will try to sabotage this deal because it stands in the way of their vision of greater Israel. Iran already, I believe, and the Israeli intelligence believes this, so it doesn't matter what I believe. Iran is at parity with Israel militarily. And for Israel, that's unacceptable.
Right. Politico is reporting this morning that the White House wants Israel to go in first in the hopes that Iran will attack American troops and thereby give Trump a pretext for war. So if this is true, the President of the United States of America is willing to use American troops as pawns to die and start a war.
Yeah. I mean, this is scandalous. This should be grounds for impeachment hearings if we actually had a Congress. The Democrats can't even bring themselves to vote on this war to assert congressional authority, although I think that's going to happen, possibly too late. But here you have Trump officials stating that this war is so unpopular among the American public that they want to use Israel to provoke Iran into killing Americans so that Americans will yearn for revenge and support an American attack on Iran. They want to, this is insane. They want a foreign country to attack another foreign country with Americans being used as a tripwire, getting American service members killed in a war that's for the first foreign country's interest, so that the American public brays for blood. And guess what? I don't think Americans are that stupid at this point. This isn't 2003. They're not going to fall for this. There was no 9/11 cataclysmic and catalyzing event. People's eyes are open here. And this war is going to remain unpopular, particularly if American service members are killed. And Israel will and should be blamed for that.
Right now, there's 5,000 of them on an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
No functioning toilets.
Yeah, and it's interesting. They docked in Crete. So they're docking in Greece, and Greek citizens are up in arms. There are street protests, anti-war protests. But former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has come out and named Greece as one of the countries that is central to Israel's force projection in the region. Greece has been basically taken over by Israeli intelligence on so many levels and is now hosting Israeli listening stations, Israeli intelligence bases. They're importing tons of Israeli wares. Then you have the island of Cyprus, which is basically a little Israel right now, where wealthy Israelis hid out during the 12-day war with Iran. They're colonizing Cypriot land. They're buying up Cypriot real estate. They're They're advancing their interests behind the scenes in Cypriot politics. So the Mediterranean is kind of being colonized as well. And you actually have to look in Turkish media to really understand what's happening in Greece because of the historic enmity between Greece and Turkey over Cyprus.
Here is the Iranian foreign minister with whom you and I have met, who has an excellent understanding on these things. I think you'll agree. He said this yesterday, Chris, cut number 6.
Nathan Watkins doesn't believe in limits, especially limits on your property taxes. Watkins testified against Governor Abbott's property tax caps, saying,
Tax caps or revenue caps?
Nathan Watkins, he's reckless and he'll leave you in his dust.
President Trump has always complained about fake news. So I think now it is himself the victim of fake news, unfortunately. We are not developing, long-range missiles, and we have limited the range of our missiles below 2,000 kilometers intentionally by ourselves because we don't want anyone. We don't want it to be like a global threat. This is only to defend ourselves. Our missiles has, defense nature. They are only to build deterrence and to help us defend ourselves, exactly as they did in the last June's war. We didn't initiate that war. It was Israelis and then Americans. We only defended ourselves. For them, that was an illegal act of aggression. For us, it was legitimate act of self-defense.
The Iranian government actually tell the American military when they felt the need to attack American bases for defensive reasons so that no Americans would be in the way and get hurt?
Absolutely. I mean, the 2018 attack on the Al-Assad air base in Iraq, after the Trump, following Netanyahu's orders, assassinated the number 2 most powerful official in Iran, Major General Qasem Soleimani. That was choreographed. Iran did not want massive casualties on that base, even though they could have caused them, because it would have led to massive escalation. Iran has always sought to balance its retaliations against the US and Israel with its desire to avoid massive escalation. And now they've sort of reached a breaking point where escalation can no longer be avoided. And so if there is any attack on Iran, the response will not be choreographed with the United States. It will be an all-out regional war. There's nowhere else to go after this point. This is an existential war. And you listen to the rhetoric from Donald Trump and his henchmen, Marco Rubio, but especially Trump during the State of the Union, when, as you pointed out, Judge, Elizabeth Warren stood and applauded after mostly staying seated throughout the evening. Lots of Democrats applauded. Trump claimed that Iran has missiles that can strike Europe and will eventually be able to strike the United States.
That's Elizabeth Warren inside the circle, leading the cheers on the Democratic side. Go ahead, Max.
So it's just disgraceful. And she's not even a major vehicle for AIPAC donations. She's just a tool. Iran has no need for this to deter attacks. But if you actually listen closely to what they're saying Iran could attack American assets. Well, why are American assets surrounding Iran? It really raises some key questions there. Trump said Iran killed millions of Americans with IEDs in Iraq. Millions of Americans, like 5% of the American population was killed by IEDs in Iraq. Well, what the hell? First of all, millions is ridiculous. What the hell were we doing in Iraq? On Iran's border.
And Rubio says the Iranians have weapons that can reach our ships. Duh. What are our ships doing there?
Yeah. Well, just pull the ships back, send them home. Most Americans want that. There's only one country in the world. I've heard John Mearsheimer making this important point. And this is the most important point for Americans to understand. There's only one country in the world whose leadership and population supports a war on Iran, and it's not ours. It's Israel, which also happens to be the only country in the world which has a secret, unmonitored nuclear weapons program with over 250 nuclear warheads. Okay, that's the only country that wants this. The American public doesn't want this. I highly doubt the soldiers on the USS Gerald Ford, who have to go to Greece to be able to do a number 2, want this. So who's guiding this? Israel is guiding U.S. military assets into harm's way. And let's be real, the reason those assets are there, the military bases, the ships, the encirclement of Iran, it's all to provide strategic depth for Israel. As the U.S. taxpayers, we're paying for Israel's strategic depth.
You reminded us a few minutes ago of 2003. I think you'll appreciate the comparison between 2003 and 2026. Chris, cut number 14.
The information that I was being given by the intelligence community hung together. And I spent 4 days and nights out at the CIA going over it and asking every way I could, are you sure of this? You have multiple sources on this. And I got those assurances. They're the same assurances that the intelligence community gave to the president, the same assurances the intelligence community gave to the Congress 4 months earlier. I regret it now because the information was wrong. Of course I do.
Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. If they try to rebuild a nuclear weapon, that causes problems for us. And in fact, we've seen evidence that they have tried to do exactly that.
For months afterward, when we didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, we didn't find the biological vans or any of that, until 6 or 8 months later, the intelligence community still insisted that the items were there, and they weren't.
Well, I reported last year during the 12-day war, or right before the 12-day war was launched by Israel, that Mossad chief David Barnea was briefing and essentially renting out the brain of CIA director John Ratcliffe, who is this unqualified nobody, and that Ratcliffe was briefing Trump, delivering Israel's intelligence straight to Trump through these closed briefings controlled by Susie Wiles, the chief of staff, who literally worked for Netanyahu on his re-election campaign in 2020. So that's the dynamic that's still at play. John Ratcliffe briefed the Gang of Eight, including Chuck Schumer and Chris Coons, the ranking Democrats who came out of that briefing and said, this is serious. The president needs to explain this to the American public. In other words, we don't oppose it. This is just a PR problem. And now they're explaining it to the American public, claiming Iran can strike the U.S. possibly with nuclear weapons, and they may have restarted their nuclear program. So it's a remix of the run-up to the Iraq War, 2003, but with more potentially devastating consequences. And it's all for Israel, because the only threat there of Iran having a nuclear weapon would be towards Israel, because Israel would then lose its complete military edge over its main rival, which actually is the only nation in the region that meaningfully opposes the occupation of Palestine and speaks up for Palestinians. And so if Iran were to produce a nuclear weapon, successfully test it, Israel would have to begin negotiating with Iran, and that negotiation would include a Palestinian state, ending the occupation of East Jerusalem. This would be devastating for Israel. And I think actually a large part of its population would begin to emigrate elsewhere. And that would be the Ashkenazi elite who form the heart of Israel's defense tech sector. That is its only productive economic sector at this point. They'd all go get easy German citizenship and take advantage of our visa waiver program here in the US. And that would pretty much be a wrap. Iran wouldn't even have to detonate a nuclear bomb.
One more clip to show you at the risk of losing your lunch. Cut number 3.
They're trying to achieve intercontinental ballistic missiles. For example, you've seen them try to launch the satellites into space. You've seen them increasing the range of the missiles they have now. And clearly they are headed in the pathway to one day being able to develop weapons that could reach the continental US. They already possess weapons that could reach much of Europe already now, as we speak. And the ranges continue to grow every single year exponentially, which is amazing to me for a country that's facing sanctions, whose economy is in tatters, whose people are suffering, and somehow they still find the money to invest in missiles of greater and greater capacity every year. This is an unsustainable threat.
The threat is from Israel, and he ignores it because the American Zionists have created him. He's their creature.
Paul Singer is his pimp, and Marco Rubio has hoed himself out to Israel as Secretary of State, which is why he is focused on the ballistic missile threat of Iran, exaggerating ballistic missile threat because he wants to violate Iran's red lines to prevent a deal that Donald Trump clearly wants. And the deal, as it exists now through negotiations in Geneva, focuses exclusively on Iran's nuclear program. It's sort of shocking to see a Secretary of State actually try to reshape a deal on behalf of a foreign country's interests while there are negotiators in the room negotiating on something else, negotiating on separate issues. It's similar to what John Bolton did when Donald Trump wanted to negotiate an end to the Korean War, an armistice agreement between North and South Korea, and to begin normalizing relations with North Korea. John Bolton just simply came in and used the media to sabotage the deal, leaked on Trump, and antagonized the North Koreans. And Donald Trump, as the president, was just left isolated. So we're seeing Rubio play this same role along with Lindsey Graham, who's simultaneously enjoying, rounds of golf at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, Trump is a separate issue. Like, where is Trump in all this?
Yeah. Do you see that picture? Is that Mrs. Adelson next to Howard Lutnick?
I wonder if that's an AI image that just sort of accurately articulates the forces that control the White House.
Wow.
I don't know if that's a real image or not.
Wow.
But Miriam Adelson was seated. She was at the Board of Peace meeting in D.C., I believe. So she's there.
Yeah. Max, thank you very much. A long and very informative
We can't be beat. Не получается нанести России стратегическое поражение. Никак не получается. А так хочется. Жить без этого не могут. Или полагают, что не могут. Обязательно нужно нанести поражение России. Но вот ищут любой способ, любой, хоть что-нибудь. Сами себя доведут до какой-то крайней черты, потом пожалеют.
Yeah, so I mean, they're going to regret it, he says, and I think there's already, at least in some quarters in the Western world writ large, there's a lot of regret already that we didn't take any of these diplomatic off-ramps that would have ended the bleeding of our capabilities. Now, for the companies, though, this is one thing that Gary was pointing out to me this morning. That shot he shows from December 2023, where Zelensky's got all smiles, and there's all these, that one right there. That's they're all happy there. And then the updated one that came out just a couple of months back here, or I'm sorry, 1 month or earlier this month, actually. His most important meetings at the Munich Security Conference. So I guess those folks, the war has been a great boon. It hadn't been any kind of a disaster. 4 years is like a good start for these guys here. But for the people on the ground, I'm not so sure well, actually, I am very sure that they would certainly not agree with that, especially the Ukrainian people who have paid all the price on this. But let's circle back around to what President Putin has said there. What do you think? Is this just him being kind of cocky and maybe it's not validated, or is he got onto something?
No, it's actually far more serious than that. Within the last 2 days, 3 days, the launch of that Flamingo missile that went deep into Russia, it hit a massive. It caused minor damage, but it hit an important munitions factory. That was carried out with the Brits and with U.S. intelligence. And Russia Putin previously vowed that if that happened, that Russia would then reserve the right to retaliate against the countries that facilitated that. That means retaliating against the UK and the United States, number one. Number two, they're out today with the Russian equivalent of the CIA reporting that France and the UK are going to give a nuke to Kiev. And if that happens, Russia is going to use tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. They may already be prepared to use the Oreshnik against a factory in the UK. So this is now, it's escalating towards a nuclear war, not away, escalating towards.
Yeah, and you see the headline right there. Gary, if you could pull up that full screen from Dmitry Medvedev, who early this morning responded on his social media there. He says, answering a question from RT about France and Britain's plans to transfer nuclear weapons. I will be blunt and state the obvious. Reports from the Russian and Foreign Intelligence Service that France and Britain intend to hand over nuclear capabilities to the Nazi regime in Kiev. The situation entirely. This isn't just about tearing up the NPT or some other niceties of international law. This is a direct transfer of nuclear weapons to a country at war. There should be no doubt whatsoever that in such a scenario, Russia would be forced to use any means at its disposal. This is where he's being very, very specific, including non-strategic nuclear weapons, which means tactical nuclear weapons against targets in Ukraine that threaten our country, and, if necessary, against the supplier nations now implicated in a nuclear conflict with Russia. This is the kind of symmetrical response that the Russian Federation would be entitled to. Now, that is a very, very sobering statement. And a lot of people say, well, okay, Dmitry Medvedev he's a hothead. He's kind of like the good cop, bad cop, and Putin is always the good cop. Well, in this case, Putin also addressed it on video.
Не получается нанести России стратегическое поражение. Ну, никак не получается. А так хочется.
Sorry, Gary, not that one. This other one.
Кстати говоря, противник не брезгует никакими другими средствами. Ну вот уже в СМИ пошло, наверное, и их попытки или намерение использовать даже какой-то ядерный компонент. Poнимают, наверное, чем это может закончиться.
So he's not quite as demonstrative as Dmitry Medvedev, but the fact that these guys are working head in glove. Let's look at two things. First of all, let's first of all look at is Russia serious about this? And then second, do you think that, well, actually, no, let's reverse that. Let's talk first about, would France and UK actually do something like hand over nuclear materials? Apparently it's not a bomb per se as much as nuclear material, some kind of claim that there's a dirty bomb, something like that they would then blame on Russia. Do you think they would actually do that?
Yes. No, I do. And I was looking. Did you see Peskov's statement today as well?
Didn't see his.
Okay, so regarding Paris and London's intention to transfer a nuclear bomb to Ukraine, he said, the West has been and still is devising plans to crush Russia. Information about Paris and London's intention to transfer a nuclear bomb to Kiev will be taken into account by Russia during negotiations on Ukraine. This is a flagrant violation of international law. The special military operation began against the Kiev regime, but it has become a confrontation between Russia and the West. So, this is no longer, this is expanding, and it's growing. And the desperation of Macron and Starmer, yeah, I could see them easily doing this. They're not thinking this through rationally, logically. They certainly have, they're not looking for an off-ramp. They're looking to crush and destroy Russia. And frankly, so is the United States. This is, I fault the Russians. I applaud their desire to find a peaceful resolution, but they need to wake the hell up. There is no negotiated settlement with the United States. There is not. That's why the United States is in Armenia with the CIA, carrying out operations designed to ultimately destabilize both Russia and Iran. Ditto for Azerbaijan. The United States is, we're not in there to those countries just because we want to have friendly relations with the Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Hell no. This is about destroying Russia. And we're putting pressure on. It may not be Trump. That's what Trump's not driving the train. This train is being driven by a deep state that has.
I'm not sure which is worse, that the United States is part of this in any regard, or that Trump is not in charge of it. That actually might be worse.
Yeah. No, Trump. They feed Trump enough to, they know which buttons to push and how to get him excited and jumping up and down. But this, like I said, this is headed for a collision, and Russia's been very patient, but they're not releasing this just to put out a news flash for the day. It's showing the ugly dark turn it's taking, and that strike the other day with the Flamingo, it's not going to go unanswered at all. And the answer, I think, will be such that it's going to further escalate, at least put the West in the position of trying to escalate.
Well, now that is an allegation against the French and the British. I've yet to see an official statement from them. I can't imagine they would go, "Yeah, you caught us." Can't imagine you're going to do that, whether it's true or not. But let me show you what the other power on the European continent, Friedrich Merz from Germany. He wasn't talking about nuclear weapons, but he sure is not talking about winding this thing down either.
This war will only end when Putin realizes that he cannot win. That is why we must increase pressure on Russia. We must dry up Moscow's war funding. The 20th package of sanctions by the European Union has precisely this goal. Moscow is not as strong as it would like the world to think. Russia is not winning.
Russia is not winning. 4 years and however much territory the Ukraine has lost. The 2023 offensive, which was broken its teeth before the first full line, they never even penetrated it. And he wants to make this, and he's looking right into the camera. Russia will not win. Make that make sense to me.
Yeah. This guy is a character out of South Park. I know one of your commentators was coming. The one guy who I believe is a pedophile on South Park looks just like Mertz. I mean, literally, you can pull up the cartoon. He's got that, sort of the egghead and such. So, I think if you did a survey in Germany, you'd find that, a sexually transmitted disease like herpes is more popular than Mertz. Okay. So this guy is talking without the backup of public support. And the European public, they're not crazy. Across the board, whether in Germany, France, the UK, they don't want to get into a war with Russia, but these leaders do. And we saw, see, there. You thought I was kidding. Gary is amazing. Yeah.
See, I know that I, with Friedrich Merz, am like him on the inside or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, he's an escapee from a South Park cartoon. Okay. So these people, we saw it with Mike Huckabee in his interview with Tucker. Because Tucker said, do you know what percentage of American people are against going to war, or what percentage support going to war? And Huckabee, well, no, I don't. Because just before this, he's talking about, well, you need to listen to the people. And Tucker said it's 21%. And then Huckabee says, well, we don't make policy based upon what people want. we know what to do. If they don't like it later, they can boot us out of office. The same kind of arrogance, the same kind of stupidity. So it's not unique to the Germans. By God, we got it on our side too. And the Russians are not going to give up. As one of the other quotes that Medvedev said today or yesterday was, yeah, we can visit the European countries the same way we did in 1812 and 1945. So he is signaling that, Russia will reach out and touch them if they don't leave Russia alone.
So, but then the question is, okay, what sense does that make? Why would any of these countries want a war with Russia to the extent that they would risk a potential nuclear clash that they could only lose on? Because that's the part that I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are listening to it and they're going, well, they're crazy, they're delusional, they're detached from reality. It's why they haven't taken any of the offense here, but they're not suicidal either, that they would take these courses. But it's hard to make the action square with not being suicidal. How could they want war and still think they're going to succeed?
Well, they still they believe their own propaganda that Russia is weak. I got it here. Let me see if I can pull it up. This is from today. A fellow who is, he's fairly well known. He has a newsletter. He's a wealthy individual, and but he sent around the article saying Ukraine has made astonishing battlefield gains in recent weeks. Germany's Merz reveals, and the title of his article is "The Russian Economy Continues Toward Eventual Collapse, and over time Putin will have to decide if he can afford to continue the war." They believe that, Danny. They really believe this. I mean, they sincerely believe it. They're not spinning something that they know is a lie. They've been told this over and over, and they believe it. Just like, you tell a kid that if you put a blanket on your back like Superman, you can fly. Well, then if when you climb up on the garden shed that's about 8 feet off the ground and you try to do it, you find you might break an arm or a leg in the process of discovering that that's not true. And so the same phenomena awaits Europe. Because what they want the oil, they want the gas, they want the gold, they want the uranium, they want the nitrogen, they want all the precious minerals, they want the food. They want to tear Russia apart and take it for themselves, because that's all Europe has been good for over the last 4 centuries, is invading other countries, raping them of their resources, and consuming it for themselves without regard for the native populations.
Okay, make this make sense to me too. So, okay, and if they believe their own propaganda, they certainly have to also believe their eyes. And it's here is and now. This is Zaporizhia, so you see that the Russians are getting closer and closer. I think they're already within artillery range of Zaporizhia down here. You see they continue to make advancements in this direction here. We have, the whole. This is where Bakhmut used to be. And then that's obviously a lot more into the red here. And you see that the red continues to move all the way to this. It's slowed down in some places. Kupiansk, the Ukraine side, had some operations to take back some of the territory, but now then they're starting to lose it again, which is what we predicted from the past. But then that you also have to go up into Dnipropetrovsk, also in the Kharkiv area. This continues to, remember, this for a long time was up in this area here. That's now moved further to the south. And then you also have up into the Sumy area, where there's continuing to be Russian advancements in these areas, and it's new ones down here. I mean, this all over the place. You can't claim that Russia is losing everywhere, that the Ukraine side is winning. So, again, I just have to ask, what is wrong with these people?
Well, again, they prevent information from being talked about. I encountered this over the weekend. As part of a group, and somebody sent out a message with it was not on Russia and Ukraine, but the similar principle. It was about how Iran is the #1 sponsor of terrorism. And so I sent an article back where I lay out not my opinion, but the State Department statistics, the statistics by a French think tank, and the statistics from the Israeli foreign ministry. They make it very clear that Iran is not the major sponsor of terrorism by any stretch. I was immediately attacked as being an anti-Semite for pointing that out. And any attempt to try to have a rational discussion about the facts was impossible because you're an anti-Semite. Well, the same thing applies with respect to trying to discuss facts on the ground with respect to Ukraine. Because when you point out facts that contradict the narratives being pushed by the Ukrainian intelligence and eagerly being gobbled down by the British and the Americans and spread through the CIA channels, any attempt to come into, go to the CIA and brief the alternative is, you are a Russian agent. You are an agent of Putin. I get that all the time. And without, and it's just, I can try to rationally explain, like on the casualty issue, that we've got video footage of all of the cemeteries that, despite Zelensky's claim that only 50,000 Ukrainians have died, my God, the cemetery pictures go on and on. You've got this group in the UK who's not a friend of Russia. It's called Media Zona, but they've been keeping track of all of the obituaries published in Russia and all the 91, 92 republics that show combat casualties. And their numbers are around 165,000. So for Russian dead. So, when you try to point out to people, or something as objective as the number of artillery shells fired by Russia versus the very small number fired by Ukraine.
And I'm sorry, what does Media Zona say about the Ukrainian casualties?
Well, they don't follow Ukrainian casualties. They follow only Russians to report on what they're doing. So it goes, or you look at the exchange of bodies.
Yeah.
Again, so right there we had the argument, Russia's moving so slow, it's a stalemate, they're hardly moving. And then you show that, for all of starting in January of 2025 up until January of 2026, the number of dead Ukrainian soldiers that are exchanged for dead Russian soldiers is at a 36 to 40 dead Ukrainians for every dead Russian. And then the excuse or the justification to explain that was, that's just because the Russians are advancing so rapidly, the Ukrainians don't have time to recover the bodies. Well, wait a second. You told me they were going very slow. I mean, if they're going so slow, they should have time to pick up the bodies.
Yeah, if it's a stalemate, then it has to be equal, and it's not.
Yeah.
You just mentioned in your anecdote there how you're sometimes viewed as you're a Russian agent, blah blah blah. Well, apparently there's a new Russian agent, and it's called this news organization. No, I'm not talking about RT. Apparently it's CNN, because CNN interviewed Volodymyr Zelensky. And I got to say, just the way that this interview starts here is something I had not seen from any Western media for a long time. And watch how, on the 4th year anniversary of this war, watch how Zelensky responds.
Switch to TurboTax.
I've been coming here regularly throughout the war, and I can honestly say that this time it feels different. The morale is the lowest that I have ever seen it. Do you believe that Ukraine can still win this war?
We didn't lose our country, our independence and freedom. We have it. Now we speak in the capital. Russia is not winning. This is very important.
So I haven't lost. Russia's not winning. But even CNN says, I've been coming here for 4 years, and this is the worst I've ever seen. What does that tell you?
Yeah, the end is near. They can't just keep doing this and doing this. There comes an end. And just in the same way that if you try to inflate a balloon and you keep pumping air into it, at some point it pops. and the popping in this point is the casualties, the shortage of manpower, the shortage of weapons, the shortage of money. There's not a single front in which the Ukrainians can point out that they've actually made progress and have been able to thwart the Russians. And now you can fault the Russians that they have not. Again, they're treating this as a special military operation. They've not mobilized for full open war. I frankly think they should. I think the time, the hopes that they could somehow negotiate with the United States, I think that's past. Trump has not made one single gesture of conciliation towards Russia since nothing, going back to the August talks in Anchorage last year. And if I'm the Russians, the next time that Witkoff and Kushner want to meet, I'd lay out preconditions before you come. Lift the sanctions, unfreeze our money, return the property that you've stolen, and then let's have direct flights between our two countries. Do those, then we'll have something to talk about. But until you do that, we have nothing more to say. You know our position. Show us. You made promises in an Anchorage. You haven't kept them. Now, will Putin be that blunt? I don't know. Maybe not. But that's what needs to be said to Kushner and ultimately to Donald Trump.
And even if Putin is polite or whatever and doesn't say any of that stuff, it certainly is. He definitely is going to have this passage that until or unless those things happen, he will continue to methodically move forward. Whether he goes fast or not, I still don't know. I have been, and I don't mind admitting this publicly, I have been puzzled why the Russians have not used their substantial power even more so. I know they say, well, they don't want to risk casualties. They want to keep them low. And I get that. But just from a military perspective, there's a case to be made and an argument that you can reduce the number of casualties by going bigger and harder and breaking through to bring something to a conclusion so that the bleeding stops.
Yeah.
But they didn't ask my opinion on that. So I'll just point that out. But nevertheless, they haven't. See, here's the thing, and this is important to point out. The Ukraine side in 2023, since we're kind of talking this 4-year window here, they tried this massive offensive operation that they had built up for many, many months, and then they tried this across a broad front in that center area there, where they tried to break through to the Azov coast. Of course, it was a disastrous of monumental proportions. There has never been, since that time, a Russian attempt on that scale that has attempted a big aerial movement, which is kind of what they call that one. So Russia has just done the methodical, slow, nibbling thing forward. They have never tried to do it big. So we don't know for sure what would happen if they did. Maybe they're so risk averse, they're afraid of repeating that kind of a thing. They don't want to run into the same kind of problems that the Ukrainian side did. I don't know. And I think they have that kind of latent power that they could apply it at some point, but so far they haven't. And maybe they're just going to say, we'll just keep going on with this until attrition has its way. Math applies here just like it does in the Ukraine, in the Iranian situation. And
right.
I guess we'll see how they decide to go forward.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's, I share your frustration on this, but they've, I'm not sitting in the general staff. They clearly made some mistakes early on, but they've shown that they can correct those mistakes. And they haven't been hesitant about firing and getting rid of ineffective officers, which is, they've not really played politics with it. So but we're reaching a point which I note with the shift in rhetoric, like what Peskov said. Peskov's not speaking for Peskov. Peskov speaks for Putin. And when Peskov says it's not a confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, it's Russia and the West. And last I checked, the United States is included in the West. So I think Russia has come to the point of recognizing we are fighting against institutional forces in the West that can only be defeated militarily. And despite warnings, that they've gone ahead and launched missiles deep into Russia.
And let me ask you something, Larry, before we let you go. Yuri, I'm going to ask you to replay that first Putin soundbite, the one that we had that's just marked Putin on there, the 29-second one. I want you've been following this obviously from the very beginning here, and you've seen Putin, how he's conducted himself and how he's made a lot of these speeches. To my eyes, and I'm not as much of an expert on this as you are, I see that the facial expressions and the vibe seems to be more frustrated and annoyed even than what I normally see with Putin. Let's watch that video and tell me what you see on the other side.
Не получается нанести России стратегическое поражение. Ну, никак не получается. А так хочется. Жить без этого не могут. Или полагают, что не могут. Обязательно нужно нанести поражение России. Но вот ищут любой способ, любой, хоть что-нибудь. Сами себя доведут до какой-то крайней черты, потом пожалеют.
What do you think about it? Again, another comment he made a couple of days ago, he was looking over at the camera and he was very demonstrative, which is just not like him. Do you see a difference in that?
Yeah, no, I think he's reflecting a more, he's no longer amused. He's no longer willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. He's looking at American actions. And as a consequence of that, as he said, they will regret it. And he's not just talking about Europe. He's talking about the United States. It's one thing if you and I are in a negotiation, I've got to bring something to the table to show you that I'm serious. What has the United States brought to the table to show the Russians that they're serious? A failed attempt, a failed assassination attempt on Putin on December 28th. Intelligence support for assassination attempts on the number 2 guy in the military intelligence. A missile strike deep into Russia without the United States pulling the plug on the intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Show me what the United States has brought as a symbolic, to really show that, hey, we're serious about this. We want to reconcile. They haven't shown anything. And I think Putin's finally come to that realization and is recalibrating Russia's policy towards the West. And it's going to be, if the United States proceeds with an attack on Iran, that I think that will make further negotiations with the United States on anything go away, or any future negotiations will be on, how to avoid going to war.
And let me just ask kind of as a final question here, since you brought that issue back up, nothing is in a vacuum. Everything is in a comprehensive whole in the way everything works together here. In the event that Trump gives in to the pressure and does launch anything at all against Iran, and it plays out any version at all of the range of things that you talked about that are possible, what impact might that have on the Russian conduct of its war against Ukraine? Because we won't be able to have the focus on the intelligence support that we have right now, because it's the priority of effort right now. That could shift over here. But much more importantly, we won't have the ammunition to give to Ukraine. So once these air defense missiles get used up here, all of them are going to go to our own needs, or to Israeli. I don't think any of them will go to Ukraine at that point. And we're certainly not going to, that's going to be way over on the side burner here. Do you think that may have any impact on what Russia physically does on the battlefield?
Yeah, no, I think it may accelerate Russian offensive. Of course, the Russians are good about planning, and they've kept up steady operations throughout winter. I mean, this has been a tough winter over there, as it has been, here in the United States, up where you're living. You guys have got a lot of cold, a lot of snow. Yeah. And from your past experience, how difficult it is to operate in the cold and the snow.
I do. I got frostbite on my feet once in an extended cold time in Germany, actually, when the heater of my combat vehicle went out, and I still to this day have problems with it. So yeah, I know very much what that's like.
Yeah. So this is the fact that Russia has continued to actually operate pretty effectively in such weather. Again, shows their capability. And the Ukrainians are suffering terrible loss, but some of their combat losses are just the people freezing to death and taking weather-related injuries. So when the spring thaw comes, when the muddy fields are no longer there, I think we will see a massive Russian push to put an end to this, because at that point, I think Ukraine it's nearing exhaustion. And it was acknowledged the other day. Was it the Germans or the Brits said, "Oh, Ukraine just needs another 250,000 soldiers, and it could win." And one of the Ukrainians said, "No, we need 3 million."
Yeah. Although where would 250,000 come from? If that's possible too, but anyway, we'll see what's going to happen with that. We'll see what's going to happen with all this. This is a very dynamic situation here, even the one with Iran. Maybe we'll go to war, maybe we won't. It seems like it's going to be a big deal or no deal. We'll just have to wait and see how.
Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada for Reason to Resist on February 26, 2026. Today, we're very pleased to be joined for the first time by Arnold August. Today, Arnold and I will discuss the ongoing U.S. wars of imperialism against Cuba, Venezuela, and other Latin American states. Arnold is an author, independent journalist, and political analyst. He has an MA in political science from McGill University, Montreal, where he and I both reside and are currently situated. His books include Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion, and Cuba-U.S. Relations, Obama and Beyond. Since 1997, Arnold has spent extended periods in Cuba pursuing his intensive investigations in the region. Thank you very much for joining us today, Arnold.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, Arnold, before we begin, I just want to remind our audience that if they find this video to be informative, please like and share it. And if you're not already a subscriber to Reason to Resist, we warmly encourage you to become one. Please help us to expand the reach of our unapologetic resistance journalism. So, Arnold, I'd like to begin with Cuba. Cuba's government just announced that it has thwarted, it says, an attempt by armed exiles traveling on a Florida-registered speedboat to infiltrate Cuba's sovereign territory. And up on the screen here, you can see an article just published by The Guardian, which repeats but doesn't necessarily affirm the claims of the Cuban government. Arnold, I guess my question to you is, in your opinion, have we just witnessed a mini Bay of Pigs?
Yes, in fact, I was going to introduce that issue with that particular caveat. It's another small Bay of Pigs. Like that article you're showing gives us an overview, but in fact, based on my investigation, what the Cubans have said, and we have every reason to believe what they are saying, that boat was within 1 nautical kilometer of the central Cuban state of Villa Clara. That boat, which had on board 10 individuals, plus telescopic lens, rifles, handguns, as well as material to make Molotov cocktails, camouflage uniforms, etc. They are the ones who fired on the Cuban Coast Guards within 1 kilometer of Cuba. And of course, they injured one of the commanders of the Cuban Coast Guard, and thus, in self-defense, they shot back. And of the 10 people on board, 4 of them were killed and 6 were wounded. Well, it's interesting. What happened to those 6 who were wounded? Did Cuba do as the United States did when they fired on the fisherman's boat in the Caribbean? And in one occasion, they killed everyone except 2 or 3. And those who were alive and clinging onto the boat, asking for help, United States exercised a double tap and killed them as well. Did Cuba do that? No, on the contrary. They took those wounded American, or based in America, they took them back to Cuba to have probably the best medical care that is available in that part of the world, if not in the world. And this is basically what has happened there. Of course, the United States is trying to spin it in order to justify their own aggressive actions against Cuba. I just got an interesting report from one of my colleagues in Cuba. He was interviewed by an American TV broadcaster regarding that, and he gave his basic, facts similar to what I am giving now. But when that program was aired on TV, they cut out his interview. So, Rubio said on the 26th or on the 25th in the evening from St. Kitts that he is not sure who is behind it. He denied that the United States is behind it. At the same time, it's obvious, giving that one example, how they cut out the information from our colleague in Cuba who gave some facts about the case. The main thing is the United States is going to use it for their own purpose in order to try to continue or increase their aggressive activities against Cuba.
Mm-hmm. So Arnold, I put up the map here. You said Santa Clara. Is this the area to the southwest of the Bahamas between Havana?
It's actually the state of Villa Clara is on the north central part of Cuba, halfway between, say, Havana and Sancti Spiritus, according to your map.
Right. So it would be, it would be more or less due southwest from the Bahamas on the northern coast. Right.
And what is important, within 1 kilometer, 1 nautical kilometer of Cuba, and you as an international lawyer, that is in Cuban waters. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that every country has 14 nautical kilometers to consider as their own. But in this case, they came within 1 kilometer of Cuba.
Right. Now, this was clearly, if it was 1 kilometer, it's clearly within the territorial waters of Cuba.
Right.
Now, what makes this, quite apart from the claims coming from little narco Rubio, who can't be trusted to tell the truth about anything relating to a sovereign Latin American state. The United States has been the military has been extraordinarily aggressive about policing maritime traffic to and from Cuba. So the idea, they've been blowing speedboats out of the water south of Cuba with reckless abandon. The idea that they don't know anything about who was on this boat and what it was up to seems to strain credulity. Would you agree with that, Arnold?
Nathan Watkins doesn't believe in limits, especially limits on your property taxes. Watkins testified against Governor Abbott's property tax.
Yeah, it's very difficult to believe. In addition, I'd like to add one point. According to the Cuban sources, which I think we can rely on, these 10 people on board were not innocent, a flotilla of people looking for peace or whatever. Some of them already have been on the watch list of the Cuban Ministry of Interior for trying to organize terrorist activities inside Cuba. So, I'm quite sure, as you're saying, that, even though Rubio denies knowledge about it, how can they not know that this boat leaving from Miami on the way to Cuba, it ran under the radar of the United States? It's hard to believe. And in any case, one thing for sure, you mentioned Bay of Pigs. Yes, that is another type of Bay of Pigs, but what it shows that, I'm speaking to my Cuban colleagues and friends there in Havana, Cuban are very proud of it. Since the latest U.S. offensive against Cuba, Cuba fought back. And they won that battle on February 25th against that attempt, perhaps, for another Bay of Pigs. Now, this, I think, is very significant. What will happen in the future is hard to say.
Actually, that was where I wanted to take the conversation next. In the last several months, we've watched people like you and me who do a lot of reporting on Western imperialism in the non-Western world. Certainly, I don't know if I speak for you when I say this, but I have been dismayed at the degree to which the United States has been able to take acts of aggression, criminal violations of international law against sovereign states in Latin America with total impunity. And there hasn't appeared to be, particularly I'm thinking here about the kidnapping of President Maduro, meaningful military resistance to these acts of aggression. This, however, if in fact the report is accurate, would mark, I think, a turning point potentially for the attitude of, targeted Latin American states. Do you think this has the potential to inspire a more militant form of resistance to Western imperialism in the region?
Yeah, well, Cuba has historically, since January 1st, 1959, has been the symbol of a country in our part of the world to stand up to U.S. imperialism, to stand up for its sovereignty, for the right to have its own political and social system. And here we are in 2026, is history calling on Cuba once again, as you're implying, and I agree with you, to lead this offensive that is necessary, or the counteroffensive against the United States. On February 25th, it was announced that by the lawyer for President Maduro, that United States has blocked payment for him as his lawyer from Venezuela to pay for his defense. This is unheard of. It's terrible. And, what is the pushback from the Latin America? It's quite weak, I would say, with regards to Nicolas Maduro. In my view, what is happening now, January 3rd was obviously a major defeat for Venezuela. At the same time, it wasn't that as easy as the United States thought, because I don't know if you saw, it was hard to watch carefully, the State of the Union address by President Trump a couple of days ago. And he let it out of the bag, the cat out of the bag. It wasn't that easy. The defense was quite solid, given the circumstances, against the U.S. aggression on January 3rd. And some of the main aggressors were seriously wounded. One of the persons actually came close to dying on the helicopter that was supposed to capture Maduro and bring him back. And he was, of course, honored, gave a special honor in the Congress during the State of the Union message. But what came through is the initial story that the United States gave, was easy, we took them out, there was no resistance. It does not seem to be the case. There was very strong resistance. Otherwise, that individual who was leading that whole capture would not have been seriously wounded, and according to Trump himself, was close to death on that helicopter. So I think, what happened there, and now what happened in Cuba, within 1 kilometer of Cuba's coast. Once again, I think we may see, as you're suggesting, I hope so, a reawakening of opposition to U.S. aggression in that whole area.
I want to come back to Venezuela. This is very important, obviously, what's happening there. But I just want to ask you one more question about the situation in Cuba. There have been reports over the last couple of weeks. I saw a report, I don't know whether it's accurate or not, that the Russian ambassador to Cuba said that Russia would send oil at this time of dire need. And there have been some reports in the past few days that a Chinese-owned tanker appears to be transporting Russian fuel and heading towards Cuba. And what do you make of these reports, Arnold? Do you think that the Russians or the Chinese or both can be counted upon to at least provide economic, humanitarian aid at this moment of Cuba's dire need, or do you think that's doubtful?
I follow those reports as you do. My feeling is that some of these reports are sort of a balloon floated to indirectly attack Russia and China. In other words, what people are expecting, yes, Russia and China should send Russian particular oil to Cuba, and China send other very important aid to Cuba. So people are expecting it, but of course it doesn't happen. As far as I know, Russia is not sending oil to Cuba. But on the other hand, China, in my view, is playing a very important role in terms of developing the solar alternative to oil for Cuba. Just in the last year, I think they tripled the amount of solar panels or solar energy available to Cuba. It's now up to 20%. So I was just speaking to a Cuban friend of mine in Havana. I said, just hang on there. If you guys can hang on for 6 months, 1 year, whatever, all those the important solar polar transformation as a source of energy from petrol to sun will make things very, very helpful for the Cuban resistance. I'm hopeful in the long run, but China and Russia have not done more than that.
Right. And one other BRICS country I want to mention in particular, this seems a bit far afield from Latin America, but I do think it has potential relevance to what is happening there. And that is yesterday, those of us who care about the humanity of the Palestinian people were appalled, shocked, and chagrined to see this. So one of the three main powers of the BRICS, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, went to the Knesset, was groveling before the indicted war criminal Netanyahu, received some kind of a ludicrous medal from I think the Speaker of the Knesset. And, Arnold, there's been a lot of debate in the alternative media in anti-imperialist circles about the role of the BRICS in the liberation of states that have typically been in the global south that have been targeted with Western imperialism. And I was a bit hopeful, I have just speaking for myself, over the past few years, that this might become a kind of, if not the spear of the resistance to Western imperialism, at least an ally of those who were fighting to free themselves from the shackles of Western domination. And then I've been disappointed by the level of support that Venezuela has received and Cuba has received from BRICS powers. And then I see this, and I have to tell you that I've become a skeptic, not about the potential for resistance. I remain very bullish about the potential for resistance, indigenous resistance. But when it comes to counting on the BRICS countries to defend the sovereignty of states in Latin America, I've become an extreme skeptic. Now, I'm hoping you can persuade me that I shouldn't be so skeptical, but what's your view about all of this, Arnold?
I'll try to persuade you not to be so skeptical, but I understand where you're coming from. It is disappointing. At the same time, I think we have to see the multipolar world on a long-term basis. Yes, of course, perhaps we would like to see countries like members of the BRICS providing more assistance to Venezuela and Cuba. At the same time, in the long run, I'm talking in the next few years, this multipolar world, is going to help all of those who are opposing U.S. imperialism. Now, put it this way, we could look at the other side of the coin. If it was not for BRICS, it was not for this new emerging multipolar world, things would be even worse for countries such as Cuba and Venezuela. United States has to watch their specific activities regarding Cuba and Venezuela because of BRICS, because of Russia, because of China. Even though they might not be sending as much aid as one would like, ideally, at the same time, they have made many strong statements in support of the right of Cuba and Venezuela to their sovereignty. So in the long run, I am not skeptical. In fact, I am optimistic because in the long run, these BRIC countries, the multipolar world, will have the upper hand on the United States. And I don't think one should be overly critical of BRICS or the multipolar world because it is something that is new, relatively new, and it's something that's in development. And I think it's bound to develop. I remember a very important statement by Nicolas Maduro several years ago, when he said, talking about United States and Ukraine, that we are seeing the birth pangs of a new world. That was several years ago. And I think it's right. I think we're still seeing the birth pangs of a new world, which is where the multipolarity alliance such as BRICS will have the upper hand against an aggressive U.S. imperialism. Perhaps I'm overly optimistic. I don't know.
Inshallah. I'd love for you to be correct. And I do readily acknowledge that this is a long-term struggle, and there are going to be, defeats, setbacks, and victories along the way. The path to justice is not linear. In any case, let's go back to the question of Venezuela. So I was there recently, Arnold, and one of the things that I did was I interviewed a petroleum economist at from the Universidad Central de Venezuela. His name is Professor Carlos Mendoza Potella, and he was imprisoned. He's a left-wing revolutionary who was imprisoned for his revolutionary activities years ago, and he later served as a Venezuelan diplomat. And what I discussed with him when I was in Caracas a couple of weeks ago was this new petroleum law adopted by Delcy Rodriguez with, it appears, and he confirmed this, virtually no opposition in the Venezuelan National Assembly. And he was very critical of this law. He said the fundamental problem with it is it constitutes a surrender of Venezuelan sovereignty over its resources. He said that his criticisms had been entirely ignored by the government, and he was dismayed by the lack of opposition to it. And then at the same time, you see reports like this, where interim President Delcy Rodriguez is holding what appear to be friendly discussions with U.S. officials, the very same officials who violated the UN Charter by attacking Venezuela and kidnapping its president. So at the same time, I want to say that I understand the realities confronting the government of Delcy Rodriguez. You know, they are obviously in a very difficult spot, and any sane and rational government would try to avoid the genocidal destructiveness of the U.S. military. We've seen what it's capable of doing to resistance movements in West Asia. So she's stuck between a rock and a hard place. I completely understand that.
Right.
But at the same time, I want to be clear-eyed as a resistance journalist about what's happening there. Even if I understand the difficulties confronting her government, I want to be honest with myself and with our audience about what is happening there. Do you see these, shall we say, interactions, these courteous and friendly interactions with the Trump regime and the adoption of this new petroleum law as significant concessions and effectively, perhaps not a total abandonment of the Bolivarian revolution, but shall we say a betrayal of the Bolivarian revolution? Or do you think that we shouldn't be concerned about this?
Allow me to deal with the issue of petroleum. I don't want to go into the details of the petroleum legislation, etc., because the audience might find it a bit heavy. But this is my take on it. In 1998, Hugo Chavez won the elections. He was installed as president in 1991. And shortly after that, he made a very important statement. He came to power in 1999, the first government that came into power after the defeat of the Soviet Union and Socialist Bloc. And what he said there is very significant, that we have a special responsibility in Venezuela, being the first country to come into power after the defeat of the Socialist Bloc. And thus what we have to do, we are the spearhead of a new movement based on a non-dogmatic approach to the issue of natural resources. I think that is really important. I think that is what, right from the beginning, the Chavismo has been able to do. That on the one hand, well, as you know, they came to power, they did not overthrow the old system. The capitalists were still there. Many of the oil oligarchs were still there. What they had to do, they had to manage an economy that was mixed right from the beginning. Not because they wanted that way, they were confronted with that situation. And therefore, I think that to see the current situation with regards to petroleum, new laws, one has to see it as part of the overall new scenario that came in after 1991, in which the issue of a mixed economy is something that had to be dealt with. Now, with regards to, what was the other question? I'm sorry.
Well, if you think that this is maybe abandonment is too strong a word, but a resiling from the Bolivarian revolution, or do you think that this is more superficial than substantive? These reforms to the petroleum law and these friendly discussions with the United States or the Trump regime.
I think that they're relatively secondary because, as I mentioned right from the beginning, Chavismo had to deal with a mixed economy, and they're still dealing with a mixed economy now. Now, what happened on January 3rd, one cannot deny it was a major defeat for Chavismo. And Delcy Rodriguez has to deal with it. I mean, she can't be, she can't take an offensive attitude toward the United States and risk being bombed again. So I think, in my view, how do we evaluate what Delcy Rodriguez is doing, whether it's justified or not? My take on it is the following. How come those who oppose Chavismo, they are speaking in the name of Hugo Chavez against Delcy Rodriguez, saying that she betrayed Maduro, that she betrayed the tradition of Chavez? I don't believe so. I believe, in my view, I hope I'm right, that she has to deal with a very difficult situation. Very few countries in the world over the last 10, 20 years have had to deal with such a difficult situation as Venezuela has been faced since January 3rd of 2026. And I think she's quite open. When she met with the head of the CIA, which you just showed us, she said, it was very painful for me. I had to meet with that person who was the head of the organization, the CIA, who's responsible for the killing and the torture of my father. Because Delcy Rodriguez's father, as Jorge Rodriguez's father as well, was part of that revolutionary movement that gave rise to Chavismo later on. And they were assassinated by the CIA. So she was quite frank. It's painful for me to sit in front of them. But what other choice does she have? She has to negotiate a situation. But I think in the long run, we will see that this tactical option that Venezuela is adopting is the right one. They have no other choice. And I think time is on their side because, what will happen? For example, it's interesting. I'm very interested in the trial that's going to take place in New York in the next couple of months. It is quite possible that we have some kind of a surprise. Like Maduro has a very good lawyer, whether he's paid or not. He was the one who defended Julian Assange. Now, what happens if the judge finds that it was illegal what the United States did against Maduro as a head of state? He should be, you know more about this than I do as an international lawyer, he should be given immunity and not be persecuted in the courts. So, time is on our side. We will see what happened in that trial. It's not. I don't think it's an accident. The United States is trying to block Venezuela from paying his lawyer so as to defend him properly. So, Delcy Rodriguez and Jorge Rodriguez and the others who are in power now, they still may proven to be correct in their tactical option to how they deal with the latest offensive by the United States against them.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Arnold. I have read the indictment against President Maduro. I have read it. And I'm not a criminal lawyer. I do civil litigation, but my take on it is that even if the judge decides that President Maduro was lawfully apprehended and that the court has the jurisdiction to adjudicate these claims, it's possible that President Maduro will be acquitted because the indictment, I mean, I don't know what evidence they're going to put to the court at this stage. I don't think anybody really knows outside of the Department of Justice, but just based on the indictment, it seems to me to be an extraordinarily flimsy set of accusations against President Maduro. I think they're going to have a difficulty proving it. Now, at the same time, I don't think that any Venezuelan president who is anti-imperialist is going to get a sympathetic hearing from a U.S. court. But U.S. courts can surprise you. So I certainly don't exclude the possibility that he will be acquitted. Now, to close out our conversation, I'd like to shift over to Mexico, where there has been, another quite dramatic development in the killing of what I understand to be the most powerful of the Mexican drug lords by Mexican security forces. His name he is known as El Mencho, and this apparently caused a significant amount of unrest in I believe in Guadalajara. But in any case, I saw President Sheinbaum of Mexico acknowledge publicly that this operation was carried out with the benefit of intelligence from the U.S. government, provided by the U.S. government. Now, my vague recollection, I was speaking with a Mexican analyst a few months ago, is that President Sheinbaum's predecessor, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, had a not necessarily a conciliatory approach to the drug lords, but he was trying to resolve the problem of interdiction of drugs to the degree that he could in a nonviolent manner. And this seems to be, this killing, especially the acknowledgement that it was done with the benefit of U.S. intelligence, it seems to be a kind of concession to the Trump regime, because the Trump regime has been demanding that the Mexican government take a much more forceful approach to the drug trade. What do you make of all of this? Do you think that this is similar to what is going on in Venezuela, which is to say that Claudia Sheinbaum is trying to manage a very difficult situation, and the reason why she took this provocative step was to placate Trump? Or do you think something else is going on?
No, I think you're right. Both in the case of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, and now Sheinbaum in Mexico, both are in very difficult situations. I would not, in my view, I would not condemn either of them or even criticize either of them for their, as political personalities who are making concessions to the United States. There has to be some kind of give and take in a current situation where the United States is on the offensive against countries such as Venezuela and Cuba, and very little pushback from countries in Latin America. For example, Brazil. Where's Brazil in all this? Or Colombia, pretty good, but perhaps it could be better. So I don't think they are, in both cases, Venezuela and Mexico, I do not think they're concession in terms of principle. They may be concession in terms of tactics, but who can blame them? They're facing a very rabid empire who are encouraged by the fact there's very little pushback from Latin America. And I think that this is, Cuba has given so much to Latin America, for example, the Caribbean. And just on February 25th, the Honduras government told the Cuban medical team in Honduras to go back and to stop the giving of free medical aid to the Honduran people. We see scenes of the people in Honduras crying, begging them not to leave because they so much appreciate the Cuban contribution to the health system in Honduras. So this is the situation we're dealing with. You have a country such as Honduras who does not have the guts to stand up to the United States just on a simple thing of humanitarian medical aid, which Cuba has been offering to Honduras and countries in the Caribbean.
Mm. Before I let you go, I can't help but ask you one final question, Arnold. It's a poll that I've been talking about a lot over the last few days, just done by Nanos Research. You and I are both in Montreal. We're both Canadians. And this poll done by Nanos the end of January, early February, found that 55% of Canadians think that the United States is the greatest threat to Canada's security at this time. Only 15% thought it was China. Only 14% thought it was Russia. So together, China and Russia accounted for 29%, which was, approximately half of the number who thought that the U.S. is the greatest threat. And you can also see there that Iran barely registers, and of course Venezuela or Cuba are nowhere to be seen on this chart. I just throw it over to you. What do you make of the public sentiment in the country right now, and how do you? And please talk to us also about the discrepancy between these numbers and what we hear from the corporate media in this country about national security.
Well, thanks. I'm glad that you're raising this issue. I've been thinking about it and meditating on this issue of anti-U.S. imperialism in Canada over many years. Like living in the country as you, I feel the sentiment of the people of Canada against U.S. imperialism. There's a definite hatred, an ingrown hatred against the United States. I had this feeling over the last few years, and I read a very important book. I would recommend it. It's by J.L. Grandstein. It's the title of the book, Yankee Go Home with a question mark. Now, this book was written not by a leftist, not by a radical, or whatever. It was written by a pro-British, anti-U.S. imperialist historian. And in that book, it's very interesting. He goes through the history of Canada, how there have been ups and downs with regards to anti-imperialism. As he said, Yankee Go Home. And what is very interesting to note in that very detailed account, that throughout the years, as he himself said, anti-Americanism is like a state religion in Canada. I agree with him. That it is sort of a state religion in Canada. I don't know if you have the same feeling as someone living and working in Canada, but I think it's very strong. And I think that what is important that now is that the sentiment, he was wrong in his conclusion. He says this Canada, anti-Americanism as a state religion, forget about it. It's all over. It's not all over. Thanks to Donald Trump, the anti-U.S. imperialism as a state religion, as he said it, is stronger than ever. We see it. We see it in everything in terms of the results of in hockey, the Olympics, and whatever. I think, to respond to your question, that anti-U.S. imperialism, and that is an accurate assessment by that article that you just showed on your screen, is increasing. It's going to increase in the coming days and years. I don't think that even if Trump is replaced in a couple of years, I do not think it'll go down. I think that it's ingrained in the Canadian people to have a sentiment against the United States. And it's very good. Countries such as China are seen in a more positive light regarding, in comparison to the United States. I think it's very positive for the economic and political relationship in Canada and other countries such as China.
Right. I imagine you would agree with me that the real object of Canadians' ire right now is not sort of ordinary American citizens, but it's the government. Which, you know, to a very large degree does not represent the people of the United States. It represents some, but many do not feel represented.
Agreed.
You know, we always want to point out on this program our feelings of solidarity to ordinary Americans, in particular those who are being oppressed by their own government.
Yeah, I personally have very strong, long-standing feelings of solidarity with the American people going back to the 1960s, when we have draft dodgers from the United States coming to Canada to seek shelter from the persecution of the U.S. war machine. So I fully agree with you. Our sentiment is against the American government and not against the American people, on the contrary.
Cultfig, follow me.